You were standing on a dusty road of the Tang Dynasty, the year somewhere in the 8th century, when the empire stretched wide and proud across East Asia. The roads beneath your feet were not just paths of dirt and stone. They were arteries, pulsing with the quiet movement of messages, reports and orders that tied the vast empire together. Long before telegraphs, long before the click of a typewriter or the hum of a radio, there was the slow, steady pace of the courier. These men, often nameless in the grand records, bore the weight of an empire in their leather satchels, and they lifted their eyes not to clocks or compasses, but to the sky. In the Tang world, clouds were more than passing shapes above one's head. They were warnings, predictions, and sometimes the only guidance a rider could trust. The courier might ride across hundreds of miles of steppe, through valleys where rivers cut deep, or along the great military roads leading to Chang'an, the capital that gleamed like a polished jewel. But no road was ever entirely reliable. Heavy rains might sweep a bridge away. A sudden snow might swallow the track, and so the couriers learned to read the sky as carefully as one reads a map. Clouds rose in forms and patterns, each whispering something different. A long feathering of cirrus might mean winds would follow. A swelling tower of cumulonimbus might spell storms, and in the Tang dynasty storms were more than inconvenience. They could mean death on mountain passes or bandits emboldened by fog. The empire trained its couriers to see, not merely look. They were told that if the western horizon glowed with a red underlight, then tomorrow's roads might be dry. If clouds formed like fish scales, scattered thin across the heavens, rain was near. These sayings passed from rider to rider, as much a part of their training as tying a saddle or mending a boot. The Tang dynasty prized communication. Its rulers knew that power was not only armies or walls, but also the swiftness with which word could travel. From the far reaches of the Tarim Basin to the southern rice fields, news had to flow. The dynasty inherited and improved upon older systems from the Han and Sui dynasties, building post stations or yizhan across the empire. These were humble buildings, sometimes nothing more than a walled courtyard with a stable, but they formed a chain like beads of jade, linking distant lands to the capital. Each station waited for the pounding hooves of a courier, who would dismount, hand his satchel, and let another rider continue the journey. But between stations, the courier was alone with his horse, his satchel, and the sky. He might pass villages where peasants bent low in rice paddies, or through markets where traders weighed silk against silver, but he was not meant to linger. His task was motion, and in motion he carried not only words but also the knowledge of weather. Imagine riding through the loess plains of northern China. The earth is soft, pale yellow dust, and when the wind rises it cuts into the eyes. A courier would pause, shield his face, and glance upward. Were the clouds high and thin, drawn like brushstrokes of white ink? Then he knew the wind would persist, carrying dust for hours, and perhaps making the next stretch unbearable. Better to press onward quickly before the storm grew. Or, if he saw thick, darkening masses swelling in the distance, he might tighten his saddle straps, prepare his cloak, and brace for the pounding of rain. Some couriers wrote down their observations in quiet notes, fragments later copied into weather manuals. Others carried the knowledge only in memory. And yet, if you trace the small references in Tang texts, you find that couriers were often praised not only for endurance but also for judgment. They were judged not merely by how swiftly they rode, but how wisely they chose their paths according to the signs above. What did it mean to read the sky as though it were parchment? It meant that a courier understood clouds as layered text. Thick, flat, stratus clouds meant weariness, a sky of lead that could last for days, making the roads soft with mud. A bank of clouds piling against the mountains hinted at trapped winds, storms that would spill into valleys. In winter, a pale halo around the moon was no decoration. It was a warning of snow to come. The Tang court, elegant and glittering, might debate poetry or policy beneath painted ceilings. But the empire's lifeblood depended on riders whose poetry was the silent reading of clouds. At the capital, officials expected punctuality. A courier arriving late might bring not only anger but suspicion. Was the delay due to incompetence, or had the message been tampered with? To protect themselves, couriers explained delays by citing the weather. A storm on the Yellow River might halt a ferry for 3 days. Snow in the Taihang Mountains might bury a pass. The clouds were not merely omens, but also witnesses. The courier's only defence in a world where excuses could cost careers or even lives. And yet, when you picture them, do not imagine only stern, grim riders. Some were young men, barely in their 20s, recruited for strong legs and lungs. They learned through repetition: ride, watch, interpret. They would ride by day, eyes scanning the heavens, and at night they would sit by the small fires of inns, repeating weather sayings like proverbs. An old courier might lean forward and murmur, "If the morning clouds cling low to the mountains, do not cross the pass. Wait, better to be late than buried." And the young would nod, memorising because their lives depended on it. The cloud reading was not unique to couriers. Farmers, sailors, and fishermen across China also looked to the sky. But for the courier, the stakes were doubled. His misjudgment was not only his death, but also the empire's silence. If he failed to arrive, an army might not march, the governor might not act, a rebellion might go unreported until too late. The empire itself leaned on his quiet calculations. Some days the clouds deceived. The courier might set off beneath a fair sky, only to find himself surrounded by storm before noon. In such times the courier trusted not just his eyes, but his horse. Horses too sensed weather, the pricking of ears, the sudden nervous toss of the head. When clouds rolled low and the air thickened, a horse might stamp and resist. The courier would know then, with a sinking certainty, that trouble lay ahead. On the grand roads leading to Chang'an, travellers often described couriers as figures of endurance. They carried no weapons of great pride, only a knife for bread and a whip for their horse. Their satchels were sealed, the contents often unknown even to them: military commands, tax records, personal letters from officials. But above all, they carried trust. And that trust was bound not with ink or silk, but with the reading of skies. If you close your eyes, you can imagine it. The endless road, the clip of hooves, the steady breathing of the horse, and above all, the quiet shifting of clouds. Each formation was a text, each streak a warning, each glow a hint of tomorrow. It was a map, but one that changed every hour. And to read it was both skill and meditation. You might wonder, how many couriers misread the sky? How many pressed into mountains thinking the weather would hold, only to vanish in storms? Records are sparse, but fragments suggest many were lost. The Tang roads were littered with forgotten graves, small mounds by the roadside. Yet the system endured. For every courier swallowed by weather, another took his place, his eyes trained to watch more carefully. And so the empire flowed. Edicts spread, armies moved, officials obeyed. Not because the emperor's words were magical, but because men on horseback knew how to watch the clouds. When you picture the Tang courier system, imagine not only a man on horseback, but also the long chain of posts, stations, and rules that sustained him. The courier was never truly alone in the eyes of the empire. Behind him stretched an infrastructure carefully woven into the land. The yizhen, or post stations, set at measured distances along the roads. These stations were the empire's lungs, inhaling messages at one point, exhaling them forward at another, and in between providing rest, food, and shelter for the weary rider and horse. The Tang government placed great importance on spacing. A courier could not ride indefinitely, a horse would weaken, and a man's endurance had limits. The stations were placed so that a rider could press hard for a few hours, hand over his satchel, and let another man and another horse continue at once. Thus a single message could travel hundreds of miles in only a few days, where an individual alone might take weeks. The empire's breath was quickened by the relay. Each station was modest in appearance, often a walled yard with a stable and a few small rooms. At larger stations closer to the capital there might be more elaborate accommodations, with spare uniforms, official scribes, and even small detachments of guards. But in remote regions the post station might be nothing more than a hut of wood and clay, its roof patched with reeds, its stable no larger than a peasant barn. Yet in both grand and humble forms, the stations mattered equally. They were measured, counted, maintained. Officials recorded the distances between them, and maps carefully noted their positions. A courier riding into a station brought not only letters, but also dust, sweat, and urgency. He might dismount, hand his sealed satchel to the waiting rider, and scarcely exchange a word before the next man thundered away. Or, if he'd reached the end of his shift, he would lead his horse to water, rub its flanks, and collapse against a post to rest. In those quiet moments, the station's attendants might ask of the road, was the Yellow River high? Did bandits stir near the mountains? And always, was the sky holding? The role of weather was embedded in the station reports. If a courier was delayed, he had to explain. Reports often listed conditions. Rain along the Wei River caused delay, or snow in Taiyuan halted travel. The stations, therefore, became not just points of rest, but recorders of nature's mood. Over time, a quiet archive built up, a record of storms and droughts, of roads washed out or passes blocked. The Empire, without intending it, kept its own weather diary. The discipline of the riders was strict. They were not permitted to loiter in towns or markets. They could not carry private letters for profit, though many secretly did. Their task was singular: deliver what the Empire entrusted. Punishments for negligence were severe. A courier who delayed without cause could be beaten, dismissed, or worse. Yet the state also recognised their hardship. They were exempt from certain taxes and corvée labour, for their labour was already constant. They were given stipends of food and fodder, though these were sometimes meagre. Training for couriers was practical. They were taught how to ride swiftly, how to change horses quickly, how to seal a satchel so that tampering would be visible. But alongside these, they were taught the quiet art of observation. This was where cloud reading entered not as folklore but as practical craft. An elder rider might stand with a younger recruit at dusk, point to the sky and say, "Look, those long white threads mean the wind will blow from the west tomorrow. Ride early, before dust blinds you." Another might gesture to a halo around the sun and warn, "Do not linger. The rains will come within 3 days." Such knowledge was passed not in manuals alone but in living instruction, rider to rider over generations. To modern ears, such sayings sound imprecise. Yet for centuries they were reliable enough, and the Tang Dynasty, vast and dependent on movement, relied on that reliability. A courier who could read the clouds saved not only his life but also days of imperial time. Consider for a moment what these couriers carried. Within their satchels were military orders, urgent and sealed with red wax. There were tax records from provinces, reporting on harvests of rice or mulberry. There were petitions from local officials, requests for grain shipments, or reports of locusts. Sometimes, too, there were personal letters, though these were technically forbidden. A governor might slip a letter to his son studying in Chang'an, trusting the courier's discretion, and the courier, though risking penalty, might carry it for the sake of favour or coin. The burden of such messages was invisible but immense. A courier knew that within his satchel lay decisions that might move armies, feed cities, or calm rebellions, and he knew that all of it depended on his endurance, his horse's strength, and the mercy of weather. No wonder, then, that the sky became his constant companion. The Tang system itself was an inheritance. Earlier dynasties like the Han had created relay systems. The Sui had strengthened them, but the Tang refined and expanded them, weaving them into the empire's administrative machine. Foreign travellers noted the efficiency of the roads and stations. Even distant envoys, arriving from Persia or Arabia, marvelled that messages could travel with such speed across so vast a land. It was in many ways one of the quiet triumphs of Tang governance, not the poetry of Li Bai, not the painting of Wu Daozi, but the unseen gallop of couriers across plain and mountain, and yet the couriers themselves left little behind. Few names are remembered. They appear as shadows in the records, often only when something went wrong. A lost satchel, a delay, a report of robbery. Otherwise they remain anonymous, their lives swallowed by dust. Still, their presence is everywhere, implied in the efficiency of governance, in the rhythm of imperial communication. At times the system faltered. Floods destroyed bridges, earthquakes blocked roads, rebellions disrupted stations. During the Great and Lushan Rebellion in the mid-8th century, the courier system nearly collapsed in certain regions as rebel forces severed roads and posts. The empire staggered, communication slowed, and the government in Chang'an was left in dangerous silence. It revealed just how fragile the system was, and how much rested on its daily ordinary flow. One can imagine a courier in those troubled years, glancing at the sky and seeing storm clouds, yet knowing the greater danger lay not in rain but in men. Bandits, rebels, deserters, all prowled the roads. In such times, weather signs became only one layer of caution among many. But in ordinary years, the courier's greatest ally remained his eyes and his reading of the heavens. He rode not with confidence in fortune, but with attention to detail. The slow shift of clouds, the smell of rain in the wind, the nervous twitch of a horse's ears, all became his compass. In thinking of these couriers, you must imagine not grand figures, but quiet endurance. The Tang capital glittered with poets, courtiers, scholars, and generals, but none of their glory could travel without the silent chain of men on horseback. They read clouds, they judged rivers, they endured dust. And in doing so, they stitched together an empire. The story of the Tang couriers is not one of sudden drama, but of steady endurance. Unlike generals whose victories are written in bold lines, or poets whose verses echo across centuries, the couriers left their mark in the small daily continuities that held the empire together. To conclude their story, you must follow them beyond the road itself, into their legacy, their decline, and the quiet lessons they left behind. By the later Tang period, the courier system was tested as never before. The empire, stretched thin and shaken by rebellions, struggled to maintain the chain of stations. Where once the Yizhen bustled with riders and fresh horses, some posts fell silent, their roofs sagging, their yards overgrown. Corruption crept in. Station masters diverted fodder for personal herds, attendants demanded bribes for swift horses. The system that had seemed eternal revealed its fragility. And yet, even in decline, the couriers persisted. They still rode, still carried messages across storm and steppe, still lifted their eyes to the sky. But as central control weakened, their work became more precarious. In troubled regions, local warlords commandeered the stations, seizing the riders for military use. The once unified chain of communication frayed into fragments, each serving different masters. The empire's great artery was no longer whole. But what of the couriers themselves? Records suggest many simply adapted. They became messengers for local officials, scouts for armies, or guides for merchants. Some no doubt vanished into obscurity, their graves unmarked along the roads. A few perhaps passed on their cloud-reading wisdom to farmers, fishermen, or their own children. For even when the imperial system failed, the sky remained. Clouds needed no government decree to form or disperse. The art of reading them could outlive dynasties. The courier's reliance on clouds teaches us something about the human condition, our dependence on patterns beyond our control. Today, with satellites and forecasts, you can look at a screen and know whether rain will fall tomorrow, but for centuries the only forecast lay in the shifting sky. The Tang couriers, with their urgent burdens, sharpened this art to a discipline. They proved that survival and success were not only about strength or speed, but about patience and observation. Think of a courier standing on a mountain pass. He halts, breath steaming in the cold air, horse shifting beneath him. Before him lies a valley road, but above him clouds are building, dark, swollen, edged with light. He studies them not as a dreamer but as a craftsman. He must decide to ride on and risk the storm, or to wait and lose precious time. His choice could mean life or death, not only for him, but for the message in his satchel, and for those waiting on its words. In such moments, history hinged not on grand proclamations, but on the quiet reading of sky and cloud. The decline of the Tang courier system left a gap, but later dynasties learned and rebuilt. The Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing each had their own postal networks. Some improved upon the Tang relay method, others struggled with the same weaknesses: corruption, distance, natural disaster. Yet in all of them, weather remained a constant adversary. Riders across centuries learned the same truths. A red dawn warns of storms, a ring around the moon means snow, a restless horse senses what the eye cannot yet see. The Tang couriers were only one chapter in a long history of human beings straining to move messages faster than the wind, while still being ruled by the wind. Their story lingers in fragments. Poems mention them in passing, as dust-covered figures riding at dawn. Official records note their speed, their delays, their punishments. But most of all, their legacy is in the infrastructure they embodied: the road, the station, the relay. These things shaped not only government, but daily life. Merchants followed the courier routes knowing the roads were maintained. Pilgrims travelled along them to reach temples. Travellers counted distances by stations. What began as a system for imperial messages became a web that bound the empire's people together. And there is one final thought. The couriers, anonymous and silent, remind us that empires rest not only on emperors, poets, or warriors, but on ordinary endurance. The Tang Dynasty's glory is remembered in art, trade, and cosmopolitan culture, yet all of it depended on the steady gallop of men who read the sky. Their work was invisible, their names forgotten, but without them, the empire would have stumbled in silence. As you close this first story and prepare for the next, let the image linger. A rider pausing on a dusty road, tilting his head upward, watching clouds drift across the heavens. The empire waited on his judgment, and in that quiet act of reading the sky, the vast machinery of history kept turning. In the quiet monasteries of the Song dynasty, monks sealed tea in clay jars, fighting mould, guarding patience, and preserving flavours for eternity. You might think of tea today as a simple thing, leaves sealed in a foil packet, hot water poured, a cup steaming on a table. But in the Song dynasty, between the 10th and 13th centuries, tea was not merely a drink. It was a discipline, a craft, and a source of endless worry. For the Song people, the question was not only how to brew tea, but how to keep it, how to guard fragile leaves against mould, dampness, and the slow erosion of time. The Song dynasty followed the Tang in a world where tea had become more than medicine or curiosity. By then, tea drinking had spread far beyond monks and scholars. It reached the palaces of emperors, the tables of merchants, and the humble homes of farmers. Tea became so central that poets praised it, painters depicted it, and entire rituals formed around it. But beneath the elegance of bowls and froth, there was a quiet problem: how to store tea properly. Imagine yourself in a Song monastery far from the capital. The monks rise before dawn, their bells tolling through the mist. After prayers, one monk is given a simple duty: to check the tea jars. He goes to a storeroom where rows of clay jars sit, sealed with paper and paste. Each jar contains precious leaves, harvested in spring, dried and packed away. He lifts a lid, peers inside. If the leaves are dry, crisp and fragrant, all is well. But if he smells dampness, or sees the pale fuzz of mould, then a season's labour is ruined. Mould was the constant enemy. In the humid climate of southern China, tea could spoil quickly. A single careless jar, left unsealed or placed in a damp corner, could spread ruin to others. And so, the monks and tea merchants became guardians of dryness. They studied jars, experimented with materials, debated methods. Some favoured thick clay sealed with wax. Others argued for thin jars lined with a lime. In every method, the goal was the same: to keep the fragile leaves dry and safe, so that they might be whisked into bowls months later, still tasting of spring. The Song government itself took interest. Tea was taxed, regulated, and traded as an official commodity. Officials worried not only about growing and transporting it, but also about storing it. A spoiled shipment meant lost revenue, and so detailed instructions were issued. Tea must be dried thoroughly, stored in clean jars, sealed carefully. Inspectors checked storerooms, sniffed jars, and punished negligence. In the state's eyes, the care of tea was no less important than the care of grain. Tea storage, however, was not only practical, it was also cultural. Scholars of the Song, such as those of the Neo-Confucian tradition, saw tea as a mirror of discipline. To guard leaves against decay was to guard the self against disorder. One writer noted that to seal tea against dampness is to seal the heart against distraction. Thus, the very act of checking jars became a metaphor for inner life. The tea jar was not only clay, it was character. The Song era saw experimentation with vessels. Clay jars remained common, but ceramic technology advanced. Porcelain jars, smoother and less porous, began to appear. Some were glazed with celadon, their green surfaces catching light like still water. Others bore simple calligraphy, identifying the tea within. In wealthy households, jars might be wrapped in silk and stored in chests of wood. Yet in villages, clay remained the vessel of choice, cheap, abundant, and good. Enough, so long as one was vigilant. Seasonality shaped the problem. Tea was harvested in spring, when tender leaves were plucked from mountain bushes, but people wanted to drink it through summer, autumn, and winter. Each season posed risks. In summer, humidity threatened mould. In autumn, mice and insects sought stored leaves. In winter, sudden cold could crack poorly made jars. Thus, tea storage was never complete. It required constant checking, repairing, adjusting. Merchants devised rituals. In markets of Fujian or Zhejiang, traders opened jars before buyers, letting them smell and see the leaves. If a jar smelled even faintly of dampness, its price fell. Buyers knew that one trace of mould meant inevitable spread. A single ruined shipment could bankrupt a trader, and so vigilance was constant. Some merchants employed assistants whose only task was to walk among the jars, tapping, listening, sniffing, and resealing. Theirs was a quiet labour, unnoticed in poetry, but essential to commerce. Monasteries too kept careful watch. Tea was central to meditation, a gentle aid to staying awake in long hours of chanting or silent sitting. A ruined jar meant months without that comfort. Monks recorded in small notes how they sealed jars with paper brushed in oil, or how they placed them on raised platforms to avoid damp ground. Some believed that chanting while sealing a jar imbued it with discipline, as though words could protect leaves. For the ordinary family, tea storage was simpler but no less careful. In kitchens of wood and smoke, jars stood in corners, lids weighted with stone. Children were told not to play near them. Housewives checked them after rains. A jar of good tea was a treasure, and to lose it was sorrow. If you think this is trivial, pause and consider. The Song dynasty was an age of refinement. Scholars debated philosophy, painters captured landscapes, craftsmen perfected porcelain. But all of this civilization rested on mundane things: jars that kept leaves dry, lids that held against damp, seals that warded off mould. Without such care, the elegant bowls of whipped tea described in poetry would have been impossible. Beauty relied on boring vigilance. And so, the story of tea storage is the story of patience. It is not about grand inventions or dramatic change, but about small, repeated acts of attention. Sealing, checking, protecting. Monks did it in silence, merchants in markets, families in kitchens. The empire's love of tea, its culture of refinement, its rituals of gathering, all depended on clay jars standing in storerooms, resisting the quiet creep of mould. As you rest on this image, imagine the silence of a Song storeroom, rows of jars, the faint scent of dried leaves, the sound of rain outside. A monk steps in, lights a lamp, lifts a lid, and inhales. The leaves remain crisp. Relief spreads across his face. The empire can wait. For now, the tea endures. The deeper you look into the Song dynasty's relationship with tea, the more you realise how much depended on the simple act of storage. A clay jar in a monastery or merchant storeroom was not only a container, it was a pivot around which economies, philosophies, and daily rituals turned. If Section 1 described the problem of keeping tea safe from mould and dampness, Section 2 must show you how entire systems of trade, scholarship, and habit emerged around that problem. By the 11th century, tea had become an indispensable commodity. The state itself ran monopolies on certain varieties, taxing their sale and distribution. Tea paid for armies, funded granaries, and contributed to the empire's coffers in ways that silk or salt could not fully replace. In some southern provinces, the tea trade was the beating heart of local economies, and because the trade depended on storage, it meant that the simplest of materials, the clay jar, the wooden chest, the paper seal, had national importance. Merchants adapted their methods constantly. In Fujian, where humidity was relentless, tea sellers lined their storerooms with lime plaster to absorb dampness. In Sichuan, with its mountain air, they raised jars on wooden platforms to keep them from the chill of stone floors. In wealthy urban centres like Kaifeng, the capital, merchants employed entire teams to monitor stockpiles, resealing jars with wax or oil whenever a crack appeared. What seems like a small task was, in truth, the maintenance of fortunes. For scholars, the art of storage became a subject of writing. Tea treatises emerged, describing not only how to whisk leaves into froth, but also how to preserve them. Some authors compared the care of tea to the care of scrolls or paintings. Fragile, easily ruined, requiring vigilance. In a world that revered the discipline of detail, the way one guarded tea could be seen as a reflection of one's refinement. To neglect a jar was to neglect culture itself. Monks saw in storage both a duty and a metaphor. In Zen and Chan monasteries, tea drinking was part of the daily rhythm. But beyond drinking, monks contemplated the discipline of guarding against mould as a spiritual lesson. Mould, they said, was like distraction. It crept in slowly, unnoticed, until the whole jar or the whole mind was spoiled. To keep the jar sealed was to keep the mind clear. Thus, the most ordinary act of lifting a lid became a moment of practice. The jars themselves tell a story. Archaeologists have unearthed Song-era storage vessels in villages and cities alike. Some are simple clay, unglazed, with rough surfaces that still carry faint traces of tea leaf stains. Others are fine porcelain, celadon glazed, bearing inscriptions of the tea's origin. A few bear merchant marks, brushstrokes identifying not just the contents but the household responsible. Each jar was both vessel and signature, a way of anchoring trust in a world where mould might erase value overnight. When jars failed, the consequences rippled outward. A ruined shipment might collapse, a merchant's ledger. Families depending on that income might lose their livelihood, and when the state relied on tea taxes, even a single spoiled consignment meant revenue lost to the treasury. Thus, officials watched closely. Inspectors, appointed to monitor tea markets, would open jars, smell and test. Some even carried rods tipped with thin paper, inserting them into jars to see if dampness clung. Those who failed inspections faced fines or confiscation. It was not simply a domestic concern, it was governance. In private homes, the struggle was quieter. Families without means could not afford porcelain or thick-sealed jars. They relied on what they had, clay sealed with paper, lids weighed with stones. Yet even here ingenuity prevailed. Housewives sprinkled lime powder inside storage rooms, or kept jars raised on bricks. Children were told not to breathe too closely over tea jars, for moisture from breath might hasten decay. Such instructions, though humble, reveal how the care of tea entered daily consciousness. Markets reflected the anxieties of storage. Buyers were cautious, sellers defensive. A jar opened before the crowd revealed not only leaves but also trust. Merchants competed to show their leaves dry, crisp and aromatic. Buyers sniffed carefully, rejecting any faint trace of dampness. A good jar could command high prices, but a spoiled one brought shame. Word spread quickly, reputations rose and fell on whether a jar was well kept. Thus, storage was not only practical but reputational. Over time, Song tea culture created rituals to reinforce vigilance. Tea competitions became popular, where participants judged whose tea produced the best froth. But these contests depended first on storage. Leaves that had turned stale or damp could not whip into the desired white foam. Thus, even the glamour of competitions rested on the invisible patience of storage. Behind every elegant bowl whisked in a scholar's study lay a jar in a storeroom, guarded against time. One might ask, why so much anxiety over a leaf? The answer lies in what tea represented. In the Song dynasty, tea was refinement itself. It was the drink of scholars, the companion of poetry, the emblem of discipline. To mishandle tea was to mishandle culture, and so, the small acts, sealing a jar, checking for mould, resealing with wax, were imbued with meaning far beyond their practicality. They were seen as measures of care, respect, and civilization. It is easy now, with vacuum-sealed packets and climate-controlled warehouses, to overlook how precarious preservation once was. But in the Song, the simplest lapse might erase a year's labour. A damp season could ruin entire storerooms. And so, lives were shaped around patience. The merchants who hired assistants to sniff jars, the monks who prayed while sealing lids, the scholars who wrote about mould, all lived in the shadow of fragility. Tea culture was not born only of elegance, but of vigilance. The boring details mattered most. A clay jar placed too near a damp wall could erase the poetry of a gathering. A loose seal could undo a merchant's ledger. A careless inspection could cost the state revenue. Thus, every layer of society, from palace to monastery, from market to kitchen, was bound by the question, is the tea safe? And so, the Song world teaches us that the grandest refinements rely on the dullest details. The froth in a porcelain bowl, admired by poets, was made possible by someone tightening a lid in a storeroom weeks before. Civilization was carried not only by beauty but by boredom, by acts so repetitive and ordinary that they vanish from history though they sustained it. When we reach the end of the Song Dynasty's tea story, we are not really speaking about the end of a leaf or a jar, but about the endurance of small habits that carried far into the future. Section 1 showed the problem, mould, dampness, fragility. Section 2 showed the systems, merchants, monks and officials weaving vigilance into daily life. Section 3 now closes the circle by considering how the song world's obsession with storage left its legacy, how it shaped dynasties that followed, and what it reveals about the survival of culture itself. The Mongol conquest of the 13th century brought the fall of the song and the rise of the Yuan dynasty. But the habits of tea storage did not vanish with political change. On the contrary, they became more entrenched. Yuan officials, inheriting the Song tax system, also inherited its anxieties. Records from Yuan tea bureaus still describe inspections, still worry about mould, still emphasize the importance of sealed jars. The Song vigilance outlived the dynasty. By the Ming dynasty, tea preparation itself changed. Powdered tea whisked into froth, beloved by Song scholars, gave way to the steeping of whole leaves. This shift altered not only how tea was drunk, but also how it was stored. Whole leaves required even more careful protection, for they could wither or crumble if poorly kept. Ming writers recommended tighter seals, better jars, and drier storerooms. In some ways, the boring struggles of Song storage only deepened. Later, the Qing dynasty inherited the same worries. Even as tea became an export to the world, carried to Europe in ships, merchants in China still worried about the same old enemy, moisture. And yet, what began as anxiety became culture. Over centuries, storage became a ritual in itself. Families taught children how to check jars. Merchants prided themselves on well-sealed stockpiles. Monks saw discipline in dryness. The Song dynasty had turned the fragility of leaves into a philosophy of vigilance. This vigilance also shaped trust. Imagine a buyer in a market centuries after the Song opening a jar and inhaling. If the leaves were fresh, trust was strengthened, not only in the jar but in the merchant, the family, even the dynasty that governed trade. If the leaves were spoiled, trust was broken. In this way, tea storage became a quiet measure of reliability in society. Governments relied on it for tax revenue. Households relied on it for daily comfort. Monks relied on it for meditation. All of it was anchored by the question of whether a jar was well kept. It is easy to forget how much rests on boring details. The Song dynasty is remembered for its paintings of misty mountains, its Neo-Confucian philosophy, its advances in printing and ceramics. But beneath these achievements lay storerooms filled with clay jars. The elegance of a tea gathering depended on them. The dignity of an imperial banquet depended on them. Even the poetry of a scholar praising the whiteness of tea froth depended on the unseen fact that someone, weeks earlier, had resealed a jar against dampness. There is a lesson here about history itself. We are trained to look at dynasties through emperors, battles, and inventions. Yet much of civilization is carried by people whose names are forgotten. The merchants sniffing jars in Kaifeng, the monks sealing lids with oil in Fujian, the housewives checking corners of kitchens after summer rains. Their vigilance preserved not only tea but also culture. The great symbols of refinement rested on their small repetitive care. And so, when you drink tea today, whether from a porcelain cup or a simple mug, you are, in a way, drinking the patience of centuries. You are drinking the habit of sealing jars, the discipline of checking for mould, the anxiety of merchants, the prayers of monks. The Song dynasty's obsession with storage may seem trivial, but without it, the culture of tea that spread across Asia and the world might never have endured. The silence of a storeroom becomes, in this reflection, a kind of stage for history. Imagine rows of jars, some cracked, some whole. Imagine a merchant's assistant tapping them one by one. Imagine the faint scent of dried leaves in air heavy with humidity. Nothing dramatic occurs, no banners wave, no armies march. And yet this was the scene upon which the continuity of tea culture depended. It is a reminder that history is not only in moments of fire and glory, it is also in clay lids, paper seals and hands that checked for dampness. It is in the patience of the unknown. As we leave the Song world and its jars behind, consider the quiet conclusion. Perhaps what makes civilizations endure is not their grandest triumphs, but their smallest safeguards. Without clay jars resisting mould, the empire's refinement of tea and all that it represented might have withered away. In medieval Europe, smoky tallow candles dimmed crowded halls, yet the rare glow of beeswax promised purity, wealth, and light fit for kings. When night fell in medieval Europe, the world did not become quiet. It became uncertain. Darkness crept into homes, monasteries, castles, and streets, limiting what could be seen, what could be done, and even what could be imagined. Against this dark, one of the simplest, technologies mattered more than most: the candle. And yet, the story of the medieval candle is not one of glamour, but of labour, smell, and patience. The first candles in many European households were not made of beeswax, but of tallow, rendered fat, usually from sheep or cattle. Tallow was abundant, practical, and cheap, but it carried its disadvantages. It smoked heavily, gave off an acrid odour, and melted quickly. To live by tallow candles was to live with smoke-stained walls, with wicks that sputtered, with wax that dripped freely onto tables. Still, for ordinary people, this was the only light they could afford. The candle was not a luxury, but a necessity wrung from the scraps of slaughtered animals. Picture a tallow workshop in a medieval town. The process was repetitive, messy, and foul. Animal fat had to be rendered slowly over fire, skimmed of impurities, then poured or dipped. Strips of flax or hemp were twisted into wicks, then repeatedly dipped into melted tallow, cooled and dipped again, until a usable thickness formed. The smell was penetrating, clinging to clothes, hair, and hands. Candle makers, often members of guilds, were easily recognised by the odour that followed them. To walk past their shops was to smell not sweetness, but rancid fat. Beeswax candles, by contrast, were a different world. They burned cleanly, with little smoke. Their fragrance was pleasant, faintly sweet. They lasted longer and dripped less. In monasteries, cathedrals, and noble halls, beeswax candles were symbols of wealth and sanctity. To light beeswax was to declare status. It was no accident that church rituals favoured beeswax. Its purity, its brightness, its cost all aligned with notions of the sacred. A cathedral glowing with beeswax candles was not only illuminated, it was sanctified by light bought at great expense. This division, between tallow for the many and beeswax for the few, reveals much about medieval life. The same light serving the same purpose became a marker of class and holiness. The peasant's cottage flickered with smoky tallow. The bishop's altar gleamed with beeswax purity. Light was not equal. It was stratified, divided by cost, availability, and symbolism. Guilds controlled much of this work. In towns, candle making was regulated, monitored, and organised. Tallow chandlers, as they were known, set up shops, often near butchers, to secure their fat. They boiled, poured, dipped, and moulded, their days defined by repetition. Beeswax chandlers, fewer in number, worked with different techniques, carefully melting and straining wax gathered from beekeepers. They shaped candles that were smoother, finer, and far more expensive. And yet, despite the differences, both forms of candles shared one feature: they demanded patience. Candle making was not dramatic. It was slow, steady, repetitive. It required attention to temperature, to timing, to cleanliness. A batch of tallow spoiled by impurities would smell worse and burn poorly. A beeswax candle poured too quickly would crack. Like tea jars in the Song dynasty, candles carried culture on the back of boring vigilance. The importance of candles stretched beyond homes. They timed the rhythms of monasteries, where monks rose in darkness to chant. They guided night watches in castles and towns. They shaped labour, for candlelight allowed work into evening hours, though costly light meant only the wealthy could afford long nights. For the poor, daylight still set the limits of labour. Even taxation reveals their importance. Some towns levied fees on candle makers, while churches demanded tithes in candles themselves. On feast days, vast numbers of candles were lit, consuming weeks of labour in hours of devotion. To stand in a cathedral during a feast was to see hundreds of beeswax flames rising, each one the product of countless hours of collection, melting and shaping. In daily life, candles were measured and rationed. Families counted them carefully, saving them for necessity. A tallow candle might be cut into shorter lengths, used sparingly. In winter, when nights were long, the cost of light was felt deeply. The poor often relied on rushlights instead. Simple reeds dipped in fat, burning quickly and unevenly, but cheaper than candles. Only those with means could afford a steady flame through the long hours of night. If you imagine medieval Europe without modern lights, you realise how profound this was. Darkness was not merely absence, it was presence. It brought fear, limitation, uncertainty, and the candle, humble though it was, stood against it. Each one burned time as much as wax. As you rest on this picture, think of a medieval evening. In a town, a tallow chandler dips wicks again and again, his hands slick with fat, his workshop reeking. In a monastery, a monk carries a beeswax candle into the choir, its steady glow illuminating hymns. In a peasant hut, a rushlight flickers briefly, giving just enough light for supper, each flame different, each one carrying a world of effort. And so, the story of medieval candles begins not with brilliance, but with tallow smoke and beeswax light. One stank and sputtered, the other gleamed with purity. Both shaped the way people lived, prayed, and worked in a world where night always waited. If Section 1 showed the difference between smoky tallow and clean beeswax, Section 2 must bring you closer to the world of the candlemakers themselves, the guilds that controlled them, the rules that bound them, and the way light itself became regulated by medieval society. Candlemaking was not a solitary craft. In towns and cities across Europe, chandlers, candlemakers, formed guilds, much like blacksmiths, weavers, or bakers. These guilds existed to regulate quality, control prices, and protect livelihoods. To become a chandler was to enter a structure of apprenticeship, journeyman labour, and mastery. Boys, often in their early teens, were bound as apprentices, learning the slow and unpleasant work of rendering fat, dipping wicks, and pouring moulds. Years later, they might rise to journeymen, working under others for wages. Only a select few became masters, allowed to open their own shops and stamp their candles with marks of quality. The guild rules were strict. In many towns, chandlers were forbidden from working at night. Ironically, even though their product was light, the risk of fire in workshops filled with boiling fat was too great. They were also required to keep shops clean, to ensure that no filth or refuse spoiled the tallow. Inspectors might visit, checking the clarity of fat, the strength of wicks, and even the weight of candles. A candle that burned too quickly or smoked too heavily brought fines or punishments. The smallest details, the purity of fat, the angle of a wick, the number of times it was dipped, became subjects of regulation. Beeswax chandlers were a smaller, more privileged group. Their guilds were fewer but held prestige, for beeswax was costly and often tied to church contracts. Cathedrals required steady supplies of large, flawless candles for rituals. Monasteries demanded them for daily offices. Noble households too purchased beeswax to mark wealth. Thus, beeswax chandlers operated close to centres of power, supplying a light that was both practical and symbolic. Their guild rules emphasised not only quality but purity. Beeswax had to be strained, clarified and scented naturally. To adulterate it with tallow was a serious offence. The contrast between tallow and beeswax chandlers shaped social spaces. In poorer districts of towns, one might pass rows of tallow shops, their gutters sticky with spilled fat, their air heavy with rancid smoke. In richer quarters, beeswax shops smelled faintly sweet, their windows displaying smooth golden candles fit for altars. To walk through such streets was to move between worlds of odour and status. Guild power extended beyond craft. In some towns, chandlers joined civic processions, carrying giant candles as symbols of their trade. They donated wax to churches, ensuring their place in religious ceremonies. They participated in politics, lobbying city councils to fix fair prices for fat or wax. Through guilds, candlemaking became not only labour but identity, a way of belonging to the fabric of the town. The regulations around candles also reveal how central they were to daily life. In England, for instance, laws dictated that tallow chandlers could not work in certain seasons when meat supplies were scarce, to avoid competing with food use of fat. In France, edicts demanded that only beeswax be used in certain church rituals, reinforcing its sacred status. Across Europe, statutes show how the state and church alike recognised the candle not as trivial but as essential. The rhythms of a candlemaker's day were repetitive. In the morning, fat had to be rendered, chopped, boiled, skimmed. The smell of boiling tallow spread through streets, clinging to clothes and walls. Wicks were cut and twisted, suspended from wooden frames. Candles were dipped one by one, layer by layer, dozens of times. Each dip coated the wick slightly more until a solid candle formed. The process was tedious, slow, and physically tiring. But each candle carried the promise of light, of profit, of survival. In beeswax shops, the work was quieter, though no less meticulous. Wax had to be melted gently, strained of impurities, then poured into moulds or rolled into sheets. Unlike tallow, beeswax did not reek, but it demanded patience. The wax cooled slowly, and a single mistake in pouring could ruin an entire batch. Apprentices in beeswax shops were often trained to treat the material with reverence, as if it were more than craft, almost sacrament. Candle guilds also shaped festivals. On saints' days, entire cities glowed with candles, many donated by chandlers. Processions carried towering wax candles through streets. Guild members wore their aprons with pride, for in those moments their trade illuminated the sacred. A poor man might burn a smoky rushlight in his cottage, but in the cathedral he could lift his eyes to 1,000 flames of beeswax glowing in harmony, transforming darkness into light. That contrast was part of the medieval imagination itself, earthly smoke versus heavenly brightness. At the same time, the economics of light remained harsh. A single beeswax candle might cost as much as a day's wages for a labourer. Few could afford such luxury. Tallow, though cheaper, was still precious enough to be rationed carefully. Families used candles sparingly, often gathering in one room to share a single flame. Children learned to do chores by daylight to avoid wasting candles. Writers, copying manuscripts, bent over small flames, their ink smudging in shadows. Light was never abundant. It was always measured. In monasteries, the rules of candle use were codified. Monks lit candles for prayer, for reading, for ritual. Yet even here, economy mattered. Records show careful accounts of how many candles were burned, how many were stored, how many needed to be purchased each year. To waste wax was to waste devotion. Thus, monks became accountants of flame, balancing budgets of light as much as of grain or wine. The symbolism of beeswax deepened in theology. Church writers described it as a product of purity, born from the labour of virgin bees. Candles of beeswax, burning in mass, symbolised the soul's ascent to God. Their clean flame contrasted with the smoke of tallow, associated with earthliness and corruption. Thus, even in theology, candle materials divided the sacred from the mundane. If you walked into a medieval town at dusk, you would sense this division everywhere. The cottages smoked with tallow or rushlights, filling air with acrid fumes. The parish church glowed with beeswax, golden and serene. The noble's hall flickered with taller, steadier flames. The candle was not just a tool, it was a mirror of social order. And so, the candle guilds with their rules and rituals reinforced that order. They guarded the standards of their craft, defended their markets, and supplied both the humble and the holy. Their labour shaped not only how people saw in the dark, but also how they imagined the boundary between poverty and wealth, earth and heaven. The story of medieval candles does not end with the dipping of wicks or the pouring of wax. Like so much of history, the candle's true significance lies not in its making alone, but in how it endured, how tallow and beeswax shaped the centuries that followed, how people remembered light, and how the ordinary labour of chandlers became the quiet foundation of culture. By the late Middle Ages, candle making had settled into a rhythm so familiar that it seemed eternal. Tallow for the many, beeswax for the few. But change was always on the horizon. The expansion of trade in the later medieval period brought new materials into Europe. Whale oil, imported from northern fisheries, offered another source of fat. Exotic oils occasionally appeared, though too costly for most. Still, the dominance of tallow and beeswax remained, their roles reinforced by tradition and habit. The Reformation and later centuries brought new pressures. Churches, which had once consumed vast quantities of beeswax, faced challenges to their rituals. In Protestant lands, extravagant candlelit ceremonies were reduced or abolished. Yet the need for candles in daily life did not disappear. Households continued to rely on tallow, merchants still traded wax, guilds still guarded their rights. Even as theology shifted, the ordinary candle endured. In some regions, innovation slowly appeared. By the 17th and 18th centuries, spermaceti candles, made from the oil of sperm whales, offered a brighter, cleaner flame than either tallow or beeswax. They became prized in wealthy homes, symbols of modernity. Later, stearin and paraffin in the 19th century would transform candle making entirely, rendering guild traditions obsolete. But in the medieval world centuries earlier, none of that existed. The candle was still fat and wax, odour and sweetness, labour and patience. What can we say, then, about the legacy of medieval candle making? First, it shaped how societies thought of light as a commodity. Light was not free, not abundant. It was measured, rationed, and priced. To burn a candle was to consume value, as real as bread or grain. That habit of thought endured into later centuries. Even today, when electric light floods every corner, echoes of that discipline remain. The instinct to switch off lights to save energy, the sense of waste when light burns unused. Medieval patience lingers in modern caution. Second, the symbolism of materials endured. Beeswax retained its association with purity and sacredness long after the Middle Ages. Even in modern churches, beeswax candles remain traditional, their flame tied to centuries of theology. Tallow, by contrast, faded into memory as the poor man's light, remembered more for its smoke than its glow. The divide between common and elite light shaped centuries of ritual and imagination. Third, the guilds of candle makers, though eventually eclipsed, left behind a model of regulation. Their insistence on quality, weight and fairness set precedents for later industries. They taught towns to think of labour not as scattered individuals, but as organised communities bound by rules. In this way, the humble chandler's guild contributed to the broader story of European urban life. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is cultural memory itself. When you picture the Middle Ages, you likely imagine flickering candlelight in castles, in monasteries, in cottages. That image, romantic or eerie, rests on the centuries of labour by chandlers who rendered fat, strained wax, dipped wicks, and counted stockpiles. Without their ordinary work, the symbolic glow of medieval evenings would not exist in our minds at all. Consider also the experience of time itself. For medieval people, the candle was a measure of hours. A candle burning down marked the progress of a vigil, the span of a prayer, the length of a night. Monks in monasteries timed prayers by candles. Scholars measured study sessions by how much wax was left. Even legal contracts sometimes used candles as timers. A case must be argued before a candle burned out. Thus, candles shaped not only light but time itself. The endurance of candle making also reminds us how civilizations depend on what seems trivial. Empires rise and fall, kings fight battles, but families still need to see at night. Monks still need to read. Towns still need to watch their streets. Light is as necessary as food, and in medieval Europe, that light came only from fire, wood, oil, or candles. Of these, candles were the most portable, the most controllable, and thus the most essential. The entire rhythm of life bent around them. If you close your eyes now, imagine a medieval winter evening. Snow lies heavy outside. In a peasant's cottage, a tallow candle sputters, its smoke curling in the low rafters. In a noble's hall, beeswax flames rise steadily, their scent sweetening the air. In a monastery, tall candles line the choir, illuminating Latin texts. Each scene is different, but each depends on the same craft. Without chandlers, without jars of fat, without beeswax hives, the dark would have swallowed them all. And so, the conclusion is quiet. The history of medieval candles is not dramatic, but it is fundamental. It is the story of labourers whose names we do not know, whose hands shaped wicks and poured wax, whose patience gave the world its light. Their legacy lives not in monuments, but in memory, in the simple association of the Middle Ages with flickering flame. Across Rome's vast empire, dust rose from stones and mud, each road shaping armies, trade, and the very speed of imperial power. When we imagine Rome, we think of marble temples, emperors in togas, or legions marching in perfect formation. Yet beneath all of this grandeur lay something quieter: the road. For centuries, Roman roads stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, binding provinces into empire. But if you look closely, the true story of these roads is not one of triumph alone. It is one of dust, mud, and the endless, boring details of stone, sand, and weather. The Roman road was at once a marvel and a burden. Engineers devised methods to cut through hills, bridge streams, and lay foundations strong enough to last millennia. But those who actually travelled them, merchants, soldiers, envoys, pilgrims, experienced something less noble. Roads wore down, stones shifted, ruts deepened, and above all, dust rose. In the summer heat of Italy or Gaul, a caravan moving along a dry road could disappear in a cloud of powder. Eyes burned, throats closed, clothes grew heavy with grit. The Roman road might have been straight, but it was rarely clean. Imagine a soldier in a marching column. His sandals slap stone, his shield rubs against his shoulder, his face sweats in the sun. Around him rises dust from thousands of feet. By midday he breathes grit as much as air. The road beneath him is both blessing and curse. It allows speed, but it demands endurance. Each particle of dust reminds him that Rome's power rests on mundane suffering. In wet seasons, the same road became mud. Drainage ditches clogged, stones loosened, water pooled. Carts sank to their axles, animals slipped. In provinces with heavy rainfall like Britain, Roman roads often turned into quagmires. Engineers tried to combat this with layers of gravel, sand, and paving stones, but maintenance was constant. A road unmaintained was a road lost, and the empire spent endless labour to keep its arteries clear. The dust and mud also shaped how fast Rome could move. Official couriers of the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, relied on speed to carry orders. But speed was limited not only by distance but by the road's condition. Dust storms in summer slowed travel, mud in winter halted it. Reports from governors often included not only politics, but complaints about impassable roads. The emperor might dream of swift communication, but the road decided reality. Merchants too measured their lives in dust. To carry wine from Campania to the Rhine meant weeks of dust-filled days, the amphorae jostling on carts, grit seeping into lids. To sell olive oil in Gaul was to wipe dust from amphorae endlessly, proof that every Roman commodity carried a trace of the road. Soldiers drank dust, traders ate it, towns smelled of it. Rome's empire was built not only on stone but on the fine powder that stone produced, and yet this dust also symbolised permanence. To a traveller leaving behind dirt tracks of a village, stepping onto a Roman road meant stepping into empire. The straightness, the stones, even the dust declared authority. A villager in Gaul might cough as dust filled his lungs, but he also knew these roads belonged to Rome. They were signs of control, reminders that the empire's reach was both practical and absolute. Archaeologists today still trace these roads through layers of earth. They find the stone bases, the gravel layers, the careful construction that gave them strength. But even now, evidence of dust remains. Ruts worn deep into paving stones, marks left by countless wheels, the grooves that show how carts dragged sand across centuries. The physical endurance of the roads reminds us of the invisible endurance of dust. Daily travellers had little choice. Pilgrims walking to shrines, peasants bringing grain to market, soldiers marching to frontier forts, all endured the same grime. Writers of the time occasionally mentioned the beauty of Roman roads, but more often they complained of the toil of travel. Horace, in one of his poems, grumbled of dust choking his journey to Brindisi. Others noted that summer travel was exhausting not because of heat alone, but because of the endless clouds of dirt. So the Roman road was not only a triumph of engineering, it was a battlefield of patience. Its dust slowed lungs, its mud slowed wheels, its stones bruised feet. And yet, these very discomforts tied together an empire, for without roads, there was no Rome. If Section 1 showed you the traveller's view of dust, mud and discomfort, Section 2 must reveal the system behind it, the machinery of maintenance, the imperial postal service, and the thousands of unseen workers whose hands kept the empire's arteries alive. The Roman road was not a single construction, but a constant act of repair. Stones cracked, ditches filled, Paving shifted. Every season left its mark. Rain carried sand and gravel into drains. Heat loosened the mortar-binding stones. Carts with iron-rimmed wheels hammered grooves deeper and deeper into the surface. Without maintenance, even the straightest road would collapse into ruin within a few years. Rome understood this. An empire of provinces could not survive without constant repair. Responsibility for maintenance fell to different groups. In Italy, the Senate and local magistrates oversaw roadwork. Provinces carried their own burdens, with governors ordering repairs and local communities providing labour. Sometimes soldiers were assigned to the task. At other times, peasants or slaves were compelled into service. Roadwork was rarely voluntary. It was duty, extracted from those least able to resist. To live under Rome was to give not only taxes in coin, but sweat in stone and dirt. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, was the heart of this infrastructure. Created by Augustus and expanded over centuries, it allowed couriers to ride swiftly across provinces, carrying messages sealed with authority. Relay stations called mutationes and mansiones dotted the roads. Mutationes provided fresh horses for couriers. Mansions offered food and rest. These stations formed a chain that linked distant governors to the emperor in Rome or Constantinople. But the speed of the cursus publicus was only as strong as the condition of the road. An edict might demand haste, but if dust storms blinded horses or mud-drowned wheels, haste turned to delay. Records survive of governors pleading that messages could not arrive on time because roads were impassable. Some begged for funds to rebuild bridges, others simply explained that rains had undone their best efforts. Thus, even imperial authority bent before the patience of dust and mud. The stations themselves reveal how much labour went unseen. Each one required attendants to feed horses, repair tack, prepare food for couriers, and keep records. Their work was repetitive, boring, and necessary. Without them, the system broke. Imagine a courier arriving at dusk, his horse dripping sweat, his satchel sealed. He dismounts, hands over the satchel, and waits only long enough to see another rider gallop away. Behind that swift exchange lie hours of ordinary work, horses watered, fodder carried, ink dried on records. The glamour of empire rested on the dull persistence of attendants at dusty stations. Slaves played a role too. Road building in conquered provinces often relied on forced labour. Men dug ditches, cut stone, hauled gravel. Others were pressed into maintenance, clearing weeds, filling ruts, patching broken stretches. Few names remain, but their sweat formed the very foundation of Roman mobility. Their labour was invisible in triumphal inscriptions, yet indispensable to daily life. And still, despite all this effort, the problem of dust never disappeared. The dry summers of Spain, Gaul, and North Africa filled the air with powder. Carts carried goods covered in cloth, yet grit seeped in. Soldiers wrapped scarves across their mouths. Even couriers of the cursus publicus, racing with urgency, emerged from journeys grey with dust. Roman writers mentioned this often, not in admiration but in complaint. Dust symbolised distance, burden and fatigue. In wetter provinces, mud replaced dust as the enemy. Britain was infamous for this. Roman soldiers stationed there grumbled of endless rain. Roads turned to quagmires. Wagons stuck fast. Even well-paved roads suffered when drainage failed. A stone road could not resist a flooded ditch. Water weakened foundations, loosened paving, and left surfaces slick. To travel through such muck was slow, exhausting, and humiliating. Roman power looked less impressive when its legions marched ankle-deep in mud. Merchants bore the costs most heavily. Their profits depended on moving goods quickly, yet dust spoiled wine amphorae, mud delayed grain carts. Every mile of poor road added expense. Some hired extra labour to push carts through difficult stretches. Others timed journeys to avoid the worst seasons. Trade itself bent to the rhythms of dust and mud. The empire taxed roads as well as built them. Communities were often required to maintain sections near their towns. Failure brought fines. Wealthy landowners were sometimes compelled to fund repairs. Roads were thus not only arteries of empire but also burdens, demanding constant payment. Travellers praised their convenience but cursed the costs. Despite these challenges, Roman roads endured because of their layered construction. Engineers built them in stages, first digging a trench, then filling it with rubble, then laying gravel, sand and stone. In some places they added curbstones and drainage ditches. The result was durability, but only if maintained. Left alone, even the best roads sank under weather and wheels. And so, thousands of hands worked endlessly, unseen in records but visible in results. As centuries passed and maintenance faltered, in times of peace, roads thrived. In times of war or neglect, they decayed. During the crisis of the 3rd century, many roads fell into disrepair as funds drained away. Stations closed, bridges collapsed, ruts deepened. Messages slowed, armies stumbled, and the empire's reach weakened. The decline of roads mirrored the decline of Rome itself. Dust and mud, once mastered by labour, began to win again. But in the medieval centuries that followed, Roman roads did not vanish entirely. Some survived, repurposed by new kingdoms. Others became footpaths, their stones reused in village walls. The memory of straight Roman roads lingered in landscapes long after Rome fell. Travellers in the Middle Ages often remarked on them, even as they complained of their ruined state. Dust and mud still clung to them, but their bones endured. To walk along a Roman road today, in Italy or Britain or France, is to see the durability of empire in stone. Yet even here, you must imagine the invisible. The dust that once rose, the mud that once swallowed wheels, the thousands of ordinary workers who once patched and cleared. Without them, Rome's glory would have been swallowed by silence. We end the story of Roman roads not with their construction or their maintenance, but with their afterlife, the way they lingered, decayed, and remained symbols long after the empire itself had collapsed. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman road network stretched across nearly 400,000 kilometres, with over 80,000 kilometres paved. This network was the skeleton of empire, yet skeletons, once stripped of flesh, remain brittle. When imperial resources faltered, the roads faltered too. Soldiers once tasked with repairs were withdrawn, governors lacked funds, local communities resisted burdens. Without steady attention, even the strongest paving stones gave way to weeds, water, and time. Still, many roads endured far beyond their makers. In Gaul, Britain and Spain, medieval travellers often remarked on straight paths cutting through forests, clearly Roman. Some were broken, others still usable. In Britain, Roman roads like Watling Street and Ermine Street shaped medieval routes, their dust still clinging to carts centuries after legions had gone. Villages often grew along them, proof that the ghost of Rome lived in stone and dirt. The symbolic power of roads never faded. In late antiquity, Christian writers compared the straightness of Roman roads to the straight path of faith. Medieval chroniclers admired their endurance, even as they stumbled on broken stretches. For them, the roads were reminders of empire's reach, both admired and mourned. Dust and mud became metaphors. Rome had conquered the known world, yet its stones still crumbled under rain and heat like any other. What about the people who travelled them after Rome? Pilgrims walked to shrines on Roman roads, merchants carried salt, wool and wine. Kings marched armies along them, knowing they followed paths laid centuries earlier. Every step stirred the same dust, the same mud, though the empire that had once commanded them was gone, and so, the legacy of Roman roads lies not only in engineering but in continuity. They tied together lands so strongly that even collapse could not erase them. The dust lingered, the mud returned each season, the stones endured. Travellers centuries later still cursed their ruts, still blessed their straightness. Today, archaeologists trace them across fields and hills. Some lie beneath modern highways, their straightness preserved in asphalt. Others remain as narrow lanes, their paving stones worn smooth by centuries of hooves and wheels. Still others vanish into countryside, remembered only in place names. Yet in each, you sense the ordinary truth. The empire's power rested on dirt, gravel, stone, dust, and the endless patience of those who walked and worked them. When you think of Rome, do not think only of emperors or victories. Think of a courier coughing in dust, a merchant cursing at a wheel stuck in mud, a peasant pressed into filling ruts. Think of stones shifting beneath sandals, of grit clinging to sweat. The empire was not marble alone, it was dust. In the Ottoman courts, gardeners cradled tulip bulbs through harsh winters, counting grains of time, awaiting blossoms that symbolised empire, beauty and fleeting power. When you picture the Ottoman Empire, you might imagine sultans in silk robes, domes of mosques glittering in sunlight, or janissaries standing in disciplined rows. But beneath all of that grandeur lay quieter labours, one of which was the tending of gardens. And among those gardens, no flower became more iconic than the tulip. The tulip in the Ottoman world was not just a bloom, it was a symbol of refinement, patience, and even empire itself. By the 16th and 17th centuries, tulips were cultivated with such care that entire courtly rituals grew around them. Yet before they could be admired in spring, they had to be preserved through winter. And here, the boring but essential detail emerges. The storing of tulip bulbs, counted grain by grain of soil, layer by layer of sand. For the Ottoman gardener, a tulip was as fragile as porcelain. Bulbs had to be lifted carefully from the earth after flowering, cleaned of dirt, dried and stored. The months between summer and spring were the true test. A bulb too damp would rot. A bulb too dry would wither. Mice might gnaw them, mould might creep over them, or careless hands might bruise them. Thus gardeners became guardians of fragility. Imagine an imperial gardener in Istanbul kneeling in late summer. He digs gently around tulip clumps, lifting bulbs with fingers as careful as if handling eggs. He brushes away soil, inspects for damage, and lays them in trays. Later, in storerooms cooled by stone walls, he arranges bulbs in layers of sand or ash. Each layer is measured, each bulb spaced so that air can circulate. He checks them through autumn, through winter, through the slow march of months. This was not glamorous labour, but it was essential to the empire's famed spring displays. Tulip gardens in the Ottoman world were more than decoration. They were stages for refinement. In the tulip era of the 18th century especially, courtly gatherings celebrated these flowers, with poets praising their forms, musicians playing beneath their blooms, and lamps glowing beside them in night gardens. To present tulips in spring was to declare the empire's harmony with nature, its wealth, its patience. But all of this glory depended on men who spent winter bent over trays of bulbs, counting, checking and waiting. The act of storage had its rituals. Bulbs were sorted by size, shape and variety. Rare bulbs were marked, sometimes wrapped in cloth, sometimes given special sand. Gardeners spoke of them almost as treasures. Records mention gardeners bribed or punished depending on how well they preserved imperial bulbs. A single rare tulip lost to rot could bring shame. Thus, winter storage was as much a test of loyalty as of skill. For common people, tulips were less elaborate but still valued. Farmers who grew them for sale also had to guard bulbs against the dampness of Anatolian winters. Families stored them in clay jars or wooden boxes lined with straw. Children were warned not to touch them. Households that preserved bulbs well earned income in spring markets. Those who failed lost their chance. The counting of winter's grain by grain was no metaphor alone. Sand was literally sifted, dried, measured. Gardeners checked its moisture by touch. Some believed ash from burnt wood deterred mould and pests. Others favoured straw, though it risked attracting mice. Debates over methods filled the oral traditions of Ottoman gardening. Each choice, sand or ash, jar or tray, was a gamble with nature. This patience was deeply tied to Ottoman ideas of order. The tulip was admired for its symmetry, its perfection of form. To preserve it through winter was to demonstrate mastery over chaos. Poets wrote of tulips as metaphors for discipline. A wilted bloom symbolised carelessness, a thriving one, refinement. In this way, a gardener's winter storage became more than labour. It was culture. Travellers from Europe noticed this obsession. They recorded how Ottoman nobles prided themselves on rare tulip collections, how bulbs were guarded in storerooms, how gardeners spoke of them almost reverently. Some mocked this as extravagance, others marvelled at the patience required. But all agreed, tulips mattered, and the true work of tulips was done not in springtime glory, but in winter silence. Think of it, hundreds, even thousands of bulbs lying dormant in darkness, hidden beneath layers of sand. No one saw them, no one admired them. Yet from them, the empire's image of elegance would emerge. Spring festivals depended on this unseen waiting. Without it, there would be no bloom, no poetry, no celebration. Civilization's beauty rested on stored bulbs and patient hands. If the first part of this story showed the hidden patience of winter storage, this part must turn to the places where tulips emerged in their glory, the imperial gardens, and the human structures that supported them. Behind the tulip festivals of the Ottoman world lay hierarchies of gardeners, layers of rules, and the steady rhythm of politics wrapped in petals. The Ottoman court did not treat gardens as decoration alone. They were symbols of legitimacy and power. To control nature was to show mastery over order itself, and tulips were chosen as the perfect proof. In the imperial gardens of Istanbul, such as those at Topkapi Palace, tulips were not scattered randomly. They were arranged in beds, ordered by variety and bloom time. Their display was choreographed, as carefully managed as any military parade. This organisation required a hierarchy of gardeners. At the base were labourers who dug, weeded and watered. Above them were specialised tulip keepers, tasked with handling bulbs, sorting varieties and ensuring survival through winter. At the top were head gardeners, often eunuchs or trusted officials, who reported directly to court overseers. Each level bore responsibility, and each misstep carried risk. A ruined bed of tulips could be interpreted as negligence, or worse, disloyalty. The chain of care that began with bulbs in sand ended with courtly displays judged by the Sultan himself. The tulip era of the early 18th century under Sultan Ahmed III magnified this culture to its peak. During these decades, tulips became synonymous with refinement. Lamps were hung among the flowers, poetry was recited beneath their glow, and the empire celebrated its prosperity through blossoms. But these festivals, glittering for a few nights, were the product of months of discipline. Every tulip on display had survived the risk of mould, frost and mice. Every lamplit garden path depended on careful winter storage. The labour of gardeners extended far beyond planting. They monitored soil, adjusted water, pruned leaves, and guarded against pests. In some accounts, tulip beds were fenced, not only against animals but against thieves. Rare bulbs were valuable enough to tempt stealing. Varieties with unusual shapes or colours were prized, sometimes given names drawn from poetry or courtly metaphors. To lose such a bulb was to lose honour. Thus, gardeners were both cultivators and protectors. Merchants played a role too. Though tulip cultivation was most refined in imperial gardens, bulbs circulated in markets. Traders sold them to wealthy households, and by the tulip era, even common families sometimes bought inexpensive varieties. Storage again mattered. A bulb delivered spoiled meant lost reputation. Records suggest that some merchants employed assistants whose only job was to watch over storerooms during winter, checking moisture and rearranging bulbs. The empire's obsession reached the point where tulips shaped politics. The tulip era itself became associated with extravagance and elite refinement. Critics accused the court of indulgence, of caring more for petals than for governance. When the Patrona Halil rebellion erupted in 1730, tulips became symbols of corruption. Their delicate beauty turned into political targets. Yet even this turmoil reveals how deeply they mattered. The care of flowers was not dismissed as trivial, but recognised as central enough to be contested. Beyond politics, tulips shaped rhythms of daily life. Spring festivals in Istanbul drew crowds from across the city. Families gathered to admire blooms, poets composed verses, musicians played among beds, lamps lit gardens at night, making tulips glow in artificial stars. These gatherings became moments of unity, where the empire's wealth was displayed not in gold but in flowers, and all of it, again, traced back to winter storage in sand and ash. The hierarchy of gardeners mirrored the empire itself, order maintained through vigilance. Apprentices learned from elders how to handle bulbs, when to dig them up, how to judge their weight in the hand. They memorized sayings about soil and sand, just as Roman couriers once memorized sayings about clouds. The empire passed down not only laws and battles, but gardening proverbs. Even religion entered the tulip story. Some Ottoman poets saw the tulip's form as reflecting divine beauty. Its petals, opening upward, symbolized prayer. Its fragility mirrored human life. The patience required to store and preserve bulbs became a metaphor for spiritual endurance. A rotting bulb was likened to a corrupted soul, while a bloom in spring symbolized renewal. Thus, what began as gardening entered theology. Europe, watching from afar, marveled. travellers recorded the Ottoman devotion to tulips, sometimes admiring, sometimes mocking. When tulip mania struck the Netherlands in the 17th century, it carried echoes of Ottoman practice, though commercialised in different ways. Yet at its root, the idea was the same: a fragile bulb, hidden in winter, guarded with care, celebrated in spring. In Ottoman households beyond the yachts, palace, tulips remained prized. Wealthy families cultivated small gardens, proud to display their varieties. Even modest households sometimes grew tulips in pots, storing bulbs carefully year to year. The discipline of preservation crossed classes, though on different scales. In every case, the bulb's survival was a test of attention. Thus, Ottoman tulip culture was not only about beauty, it was about order, patience, and the politics of refinement. From imperial gardeners at Topkapi to farmers in Anatolia, from poets in Istanbul to merchants in provincial markets, all participated in the rhythm of bulbs and blooms. The empire's identity was reflected not only in mosques and armies, but in sand-filled trays lying in dark storerooms waiting for spring. We end the story of Ottoman tulips not in the glittering light of festivals, but in the long shadow of memory. The tulip, so carefully preserved through winters, became more than a flower. It became a legacy that outlasted sultans, rebellions, and even the empire itself. By the close of the tulip era in 1730, the bloom had already become controversial. Rebels who stormed Istanbul tore up gardens, seeing tulips as symbols of extravagance. For a time, the flower seemed tainted by politics, yet even rebellion could not erase the habits of preservation. Gardeners still stored bulbs each winter. Families still protected their small plots. Merchants still traded varieties. The rhythms of digging, drying, layering in sand, and waiting for spring continued, long after festivals fell silent. The tulip's survival depended not on palaces but on patience. In Anatolia, provincial farmers kept bulbs as side income. In Istanbul, ordinary households planted them in courtyards. Even without courtly patronage, the cycle endured. Year after year, bulbs were lifted, sorted, and stored. The empire's grand gestures faded, but its boring routines persisted, and in that persistence, tulips carried Ottoman culture into the future. Travellers in the 18th and 19th centuries still remarked on the flowers of Istanbul. European visitors compared them to their own tulip traditions, noting both similarities and differences. The Dutch, whose tulip mania had once collapsed in speculation, now looked to the Ottomans as the flower's cultural guardians. They admired the patience with which bulbs were kept, the care in their arrangement, the quiet devotion to their beauty. The symbolism of tulips only deepened. Ottoman poets continued to weave them into metaphors, for fragility, for discipline, for fleeting beauty. Religious thinkers still saw in their upward petals echoes of prayer. Families passed down stories of rare varieties, giving them names, remembering their shapes. Even as politics changed, tulips endured as cultural memory. What makes this story striking is how much rested on winter silence. A tulip festival might dazzle thousands, but its foundation was months of unseen care. Bulbs stored in darkness determined whether spring would succeed. A careless gardener, a damp storeroom, a hungry mouse, any of these could erase an entire season's beauty. And so, the empire's image of refinement depended not on grand displays alone, but on the boring patience of men bent over trays of bulbs in the cold months. By the 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire weakened, tulips became nostalgic symbols. They were painted on tiles, embroidered on textiles, carved into stone. They became part of Ottoman visual identity, a motif seen everywhere from mosques to household objects. The flower, once fragile in sand, became immortal in art. The patience of gardeners was transformed into the permanence of design. Today, tulips remain part of Istanbul's landscape. Each spring, festivals fill parks with blooms recalling the tulip era. Visitors admire the colours, photograph the beds, stroll beneath blossoms. Few think of the winter storage, the trays of bulbs, the sand counted grain by grain. Yet without that ancient patience, the tulip might never have endured to become a modern symbol of Turkey. The lesson of the tulip is the same as the lesson of many histories. Glory rests on boredom. Spring festivals depended on winter storage. Beauty depended on dirt, sand, and vigilance. Memory depended on nameless gardeners, whose hands preserved bulbs through damp and cold. Empires are remembered for armies and palaces, but they are sustained by patience and silence. So imagine it, as this story closes. A dark storeroom in Istanbul centuries ago. Shelves hold trays of tulip bulbs, each one nestled in sand. Outside, snow falls or rain drips from eaves. Inside, a gardener checks the bulbs one by one, ensuring they will last until spring. He's not a poet, nor a sultan, nor a rebel. He's anonymous, forgotten. Yet through his patience, the empire's beauty endures. In 18th century Vienna, the sharp cry of a post horn cut through streets, carrying news swifter than any rider's weary body. If you lived in the 18th century Vienna, you would have known the sound before you saw the rider. A clear, piercing note rising above the clatter of the hooves, above the chatter of streets, above even the tolling of church bells. It was the post horn, a simple brass instrument, small enough to sling across a rider's chest, yet important enough to clear a path through crowded roads. In an age before telegraphs and railways, the post horn was not entertainment, it was urgency. The Austrian postal system was one of Europe's most organised, built on relay stations and strict timetables. Riders carried mail, official documents, and sometimes passengers in carriages. But unlike ordinary travellers, they had priority. Inns were required to give them fresh horses, towns were obliged to open gates for them, and citizens were expected to move aside. And the signal that demanded this obedience was the horn. Imagine yourself standing on a narrow cobbled street in Vienna. The smell of bread from a baker's, shop drifts out, children chase one another, carts creak under the weight of firewood. Suddenly a note cuts through, the post horn's call. Instantly people pull back, drivers urge oxen aside, children scatter, doors open to let the courier pass. The sound carried authority not because of music, but because of law. To ignore the horn was to risk fine or punishment. The horn itself was plain, a coiled brass tube, polished enough to shine but simple in shape. Its notes were limited, just a few calls, yet each had meaning. A long note might signal departure, a short blast arrival, a sequence urgency. In relay stations, attendants knew these signals. A rider approaching would blow, and stable boys rushed to prepare horses. The postmaster would step out, documents ready to exchange. All of this happened faster because of the horn. Why a horn and not words? Because sound travelled further. On country roads, a rider blowing the horn could warn ahead of his coming, clearing paths before he arrived. In towns, it announced authority without the need for explanation. Music was language. A single note meant more than shouted words could. In this way, the horn carried urgency faster than the rider himself. Travellers recorded the sound often. Some described it as shrill, others as noble. For ordinary citizens, it was both disruption and reassurance. Disruption, because it forced them aside. Reassurance, because it meant the empire's arteries were working, messages flowing, orders moving. The sound of the horn was the sound of governance itself. The use of horns was not unique to Vienna. Across Europe, postal riders used similar signals. But in Vienna, where music filled the culture, from street fiddlers to opera houses, the horn took on a special place. Composers even borrowed its call. In symphonies and chamber music, you sometimes hear echoes of the post horn. Sharp, bright notes meant to remind listeners of speed, urgency, and travel. What began as postal signal entered culture as metaphor. Behind the sound lay a system of relay stations placed carefully along main roads. Each station had horses, attendants, and records. Riders did not travel entire distances alone. They carried satchels from one station to the next, exchanging horses and often handing the mail to another courier. In this way, news moved faster than any single man could. The horn was what kept the rhythm steady, ensuring each station was prepared at the exact moment of arrival. This rhythm shaped daily life. Villages along major routes knew the times of horns. Children learned to imitate them. Farmers paused their work when they heard them, watching riders flash past. Inns measured their routines by postal riders stopping briefly to change horses. The empire's presence was not always in soldiers or officials, but in a brass note echoing through fields and towns. For the couriers themselves, the horn was more than tool. It was authority. Without it, they were ordinary riders, easily delayed by carts or blocked by gates. With it, they became messengers of empire. The horn gave them the right to priority, a right backed by law. A young courier might carry nothing more than sealed letters in his satchel, but when he lifted his horn he spoke with the voice of the state, and yet to hold such power was also burden. Riders were judged harshly for delays. Accidents, weather, or poor horses might slow them, but excuses were seldom accepted. The horn did not only clear their way, it bound them to speed. Every blast was a promise that they would not linger, that the empire's time moved faster than the individual's fatigue. So when you think of Vienna in the 18th century, do not think only of its glittering opera halls. Think also of narrow roads where dust rose behind riders, and brass horns cut through air like sharp commands. Think of villages where people stepped aside at a note, and of relay stations where boys sprang into action at a signal. The post horn was not music alone. It was the empire's clock, announcing every moment that governance depended on speed. The sharp note of the post horn was only the surface of a much larger system. To understand how Vienna's postal service worked in the 18th century, we must step behind the sound, into the relay stations, the lives of the riders, and the rhythms of empire that depended on this chain of men, horses, and brass calls. The cursus publicus of Rome had long disappeared, but the Habsburg monarchy created its own version of a postal artery. By the 18th century, roads leading into Vienna were lined with posthäuser, post houses, spaced at predictable distances, usually a few hours' ride apart. Each station maintained fresh horses, stables, fodder, and attendants. Some stations were modest inns, others larger complexes with sleeping quarters and kitchens. Their single purpose was to keep the mail moving. A courier never rode from Prague to Vienna or from Trieste to the capital in one journey. Instead, he covered a stretch, blew his horn upon arrival and handed over the satchel. Another rider, fresh and waiting, took it and sped onward. The horse too was exchanged, a weary animal replaced by one recently watered and fed. In this way, a letter might travel hundreds of kilometres in only a few days, far faster than any merchant or pilgrim. The horn was essential to this rhythm. Without it, a station could be caught unprepared. With it, stable boys ran out, tightening saddles, leading horses into position. Postmasters stepped into doorways, checking their records. Inns bustled to bring food or water for men who could stay no longer than minutes. All of this urgency depended on hearing a note in time. The riders themselves were a peculiar class. They were not aristocrats nor ordinary peasants. They were employees of the state sworn to punctuality. Their lives were marked by long hours in saddle, harsh weather, and constant pressure. A rider might gallop through snow, through rain, through burning summer dust, knowing that delay could bring reprimand. They were paid modest wages, sometimes supplemented by carrying private letters. Though this was officially forbidden, their uniform authority came not from wealth, but from their horn. Training was simple, but strict. A rider learned how to care for horses, how to secure satchels, how to signal properly with the horn. He learned routes by memory, distances between stations and the times expected. He was told never to linger, never to allow interference, never to lose the satchel. In practice, dangers existed. Bandits, broken bridges, storms. Riders sometimes disappeared, their fates unknown. But the system was large enough to absorb losses. Another rider, another horn, another horse always replaced the missing. The notes themselves became a language. Each rider was expected to know the signals, different blasts for arrival, departure, or danger. Villagers recognized them too. Children imitated them, echoing the calls across fields. Travellers came to associate certain tunes with speed and authority. To hear the post horn was to know that mail, orders, or perhaps urgent news of war was moving swiftly across the land. This speed shaped the empire's politics. Orders from Vienna to distant provinces could arrive in days instead of weeks. A rebellion in Hungary, a skirmish in the Balkans, a trade dispute in Bohemia, all could be reported quickly. Couriers carried more than mail, they carried governance. The empire's reach depended less on armies than on information, and information moved by horse, by horn, by relay station. Villages along post roads lived in rhythm with this system. The sight of riders dashing past became part of their landscape. Some villagers offered food or drink in exchange for news, though riders were forbidden to linger. Inns near stations prospered from the constant flow of men and animals. Farmers sold fodder to postmasters, stable boys found work tending horses, Blacksmiths earned coin repairing shoes and harnesses. The post horn's note echoed not only urgency but economy. Yet for all its efficiency, the system remained fragile. Muddy roads delayed riders, snow-blocked passes, swollen rivers halted ferries, horses lamed, riders fell ill. Postmasters complained of insufficient fodder or poor wages, and still, the horn demanded that the schedule be kept. It was both tool and burden, promising more than human bodies could always fulfill. Vienna itself lived to the sound. Residents near the city gates knew the horns of arriving posts. Merchants timed business to them, eager for letters from abroad. Nobles listened for them, awaiting orders or gossip. Even musicians heard them, turning their simple calls into themes within symphonies. The post horn slipped from road to stage, its authority transformed into melody. In this way, the boring detail of communication became part of high culture. The authority of the horn extended into law regulations stated clearly that riders had right of way, gates must be opened, carts pulled aside, ferries yielded. To resist was to risk fine or punishment. The state's urgency was embodied in the sound of brass. Even a farmer trudging home at dusk knew to step aside when he heard the note. Thus, empire moved not only by decree, but by music that commanded obedience. Behind all of this was endless paperwork. Each post station kept records, times of arrivals, condition of horses, numbers of letters passed through. Clerks noted delays, explained reasons, calculated wages. The system of speed was built on repetition, on ink drying in ledgers as much as on hooves striking stone. If the horn was the voice of the system, paper was its memory. The rhythm of horn, horse and record became the empire's pulse. To live in 18th century Vienna was to know that sound, to trust that behind it stretched a network connecting provinces to the capital. It was mundane, repetitive, sometimes irritating, but essential. Without it, orders slowed, news faltered, the empire weakened. By the time the 18th century reached its close, the post horn had already become more than a courier's tool. It was a sound etched into memory, woven into music, and carried forward as a symbol long after its practical urgency began to fade. To finish this story, we must follow the horn's slow transformation from command to culture, from empire's necessity to history's echo. The 19th century brought railways and telegraphs. Where once a courier's gallop was the fastest speed imaginable, now locomotives roared across Europe. The telegraph sent news in minutes instead of days. Against this new pace, the horn seemed old-fashioned, and yet it did not vanish overnight. Riders still carried it, trains even adopted it, and the post horn became a mark of continuity. Where once it had cleared carts from muddy lanes, now it announced the arrival of stagecoaches into modern cities. But as its function shrank, its symbolism grew. Composers borrowed its calls. Mozart, Haydn, and later Mahler wove post-horn themes into their music. These were not just melodies, they were reminders of the empire's arteries, of roads filled with dust and riders, of a world where information depended on breath and brass. In concert halls, listeners heard not just notes, but the memory of movement. The horn had become nostalgia. Vienna itself preserved the sound in culture. Inns hung signboards painted with post horns, marking themselves as official stops. Letters bore wax seals stamped with horn symbols, declaring their connection to the imperial post. Even as telegraphs took over, the image of the horn remained shorthand for communication. To see it was to think of speed, reliability and authority. For ordinary people, the horn was memory of daily life. Older generations remembered stepping aside for riders, remembered the piercing blasts at dusk or dawn. Children of the 19th century mimicked the sounding games, though fewer heard it in reality. Slowly the horn became a story told rather than a sound lived. The decline of the horn mirrored a larger truth. Every system of communication eventually gives way to another, yet symbols linger. Where once the Roman road endured in dust and stone, the Austrian post horn endured in brass and melody. Function fades, memory survives. If you imagine Vienna in the late 18th century, you hear both horns, the practical calls clearing streets, and the musical echoes in salons and theatres. One belonged to couriers, the other to composers, yet both spoke the same message. That sound can carry authority faster than men. Today, the post horn still survives, though mostly as emblem. Postal services across Europe kept its image as their symbol into the 20th century. Stamps bore it, logos displayed it. Even as airplanes carried letters and satellites transmitted signals, the horn's curve reminded people of horses and roads. It is no longer heard, but it is still seen. And perhaps that is its greatest legacy. It reminds us that the most ordinary sounds of one age, shrill, repetitive, even irritating, can become the treasured symbols of another. The post horn was never meant to be beautiful, it was meant to be obeyed. Yet in the memory of Vienna, in the music of composers, in the symbols of postal systems, it became something more enduring than obedience. It became culture. So when you think of Vienna in its great century of music, do not forget the humble note that echoed outside concert halls. Do not forget the rider in dust, lifting a brass horn to lips, clearing a path through towns. Do not forget the urgency carried faster by sound than by man. The post horn story is not glamorous, but it is lasting. In the Ming Dynasty, bricklayers built walls handspan by handspan, each stone a measure of patience, empire, and the weight of centuries. When we think of the Ming Dynasty, we often picture the Great Wall stretching across mountains, its towers standing against the sky. We imagine scale, grandeur, endurance. Yet behind this monumental structure lay the daily work of bricklayers, men who measured not in miles or centuries but in handspans. The story of the wall is not only about emperors and generals, it is also about mortar drying in sun, bricks stacked in endless lines, and workers whose days were spent repeating the same motions one hand after another. The Ming rulers, particularly during the 15th and 16th centuries, undertook massive wall-building projects to defend against incursions from the north. Earlier dynasties had raised walls of tamped earth. The Ming innovated by facing many sections with bricks and stone. Stronger, more durable, more imposing, but also infinitely more labour-intensive. For every brick set in the wall, someone had to mould clay, fire it in a kiln, carry it to the mountains and lay it with mortar. Imagine the life of a bricklayer assigned to the wall. He wakes, before dawn, eats a simple meal of millet porridge, and joins his work crew. Together they climb the rough path to a section under construction. Donkeys bray, carrying baskets of bricks. Labourers stagger under poles loaded with mortar jars. At the site, supervisors direct the placement of each load. The bricklayer squats, sets a brick in place, checks its alignment by hand, taps it with a wooden mallet and smooths the mortar. Then another brick, and another. Hours pass. The sun rises higher. Sweat soaks his tunic. Dust fills his lungs. By evening, the wall has grown only a little taller, perhaps a single layer of bricks along a few meters. Progress was slow because precision mattered. Bricks were measured not with rulers, but with hands. A foreman might spread his fingers across a brick to judge consistency. Workers compared each brick to their palms, ensuring even size. In this way, human bodies became tools of measurement. A handspan of one man, repeated thousands of times, set the rhythm of the wall. The mortar too required care. Made from lime, water, and sometimes glutinous rice paste, it had to be mixed evenly, not too wet, not too dry. Too thin, and bricks slid. Too thick, and they cracked. Workers stirred mortar with paddles, tested it by touch, judged its readiness by sight. These small judgments, repeated daily, determined whether the wall would endure centuries or crumble within decades. The labour force was vast. Soldiers, peasants, convicts, all were drafted. Some worked under contract, others under coercion. Many died under harsh conditions, exhaustion, hunger, accidents, disease. For those who survived, life settled into monotony. A wall 1,000 miles long was for each man just one brick after another, yet within this monotony lay meaning. Supervisors recorded progress meticulously. Reports noted how many bricks were laid, how many sections completed, how much mortar consumed. To emperors and ministers, the wall was a statistic. To bricklayers, it was a daily endurance of handspans and hours. The two perspectives rarely met, yet both were necessary. The dream of grandeur and the patience of labour. The bricks themselves varied. Some were large, requiring 2 men to carry. Others were smaller, shaped by moulds pressed into clay. Firing was another discipline. Kilns had to be fed with wood or coal, fires maintained at steady heat. bricks cooled slowly to avoid cracks. A single poorly fired batch could waste weeks of labour. Thus, behind the wall you see today lies an invisible network of kilns, forests felled for fuel, and workers feeding flames day and night. Transport was as laborious as laying. Bricks made in lowland kilns had to be hauled to mountain ridges. Donkeys and oxen carried them in baskets, but in steep terrain men themselves bore the loads. Archaeological records tell of paths lined with dropped bricks, abandoned where carriers stumbled or gave out. Each brick on the wall carries the weight not only of clay and fire, but of sweat and bone. Standing on the wall today you see towers, battlements, vistas stretching across hills. But in the 15th century a bricklayer saw only the brick in his hand, the span of mortar he had to smooth, the foreman's call to keep working. History remembers emperors. The wall remembers hands. If the first part of this story showed the bricklayer's handspan, the second part must turn to the larger system that organised these hands, the structure of labour, the flow of materials, and the immense human cost hidden within the wall. The Great Wall under the Ming was not a single continuous project. It was a patchwork of campaigns, ordered by emperors in response to threats from the north. Yet each campaign demanded the same ingredients: bricks, mortar, timber, stone, lime, food, water, and above all labour. Without these, no emperor's command could rise into mountains of stone. Labour came first, and it came heavily. Soldiers garrisoned near frontier zones were often assigned construction duty. They carried bricks by day and kept watch by night. Peasants were conscripted from surrounding villages, compelled to leave their fields. Convicts too were sent. Their sentences commuted into years of hard labour on the wall. The system spared no class of men. In some regions, even women and children were called to carry water, prepare meals, or transport lighter loads. Work was relentless. During building seasons, spring through autumn, labourers rose before dawn and worked until dusk. Supervisors, appointed by local officials, measured output daily. Progress was recorded in ledgers: how many bricks set, how many feet of wall raised. Punishments for slowness were severe. Whips and rods enforced pace. For many workers, the wall was not glory but punishment. Logistics made the work harder. Bricks fired in kilns had to be transported over long distances. In lowland areas, carts carried them, wheels creaking under the weight. But in mountainous zones, carts were useless. Donkeys, mules and oxen bore baskets of bricks along narrow paths. Where animals could not go, men carried them, 2 or 3 bricks strapped to wooden frames on their backs. Step by step, breath by breath, the bricks ascended ridges. Many collapsed on the way. Mortar was another challenge. Lime had to be quarried, burned and mixed with water. Sometimes glutinous rice paste was added to strengthen the bond. The mixture was then hauled in jars or buckets to construction sites. Too much delay and the mortar dried before use. Too little and walls collapsed. Precision mattered, and precision required constant oversight. Food supply was as vital as bricks. Armies of workers needed grain, vegetables, and water. Local villages were taxed to provide it. Fields were strained to feed builders instead of families. Records speak of famine in some regions, worsened by wall projects. Workers often ate little more than millet gruel and pickled greens day after day, their bodies worn thin by exertion. The toll was immense. Deaths were common from exhaustion, malnutrition, accidents or disease. Men fell from heights, were crushed under stones, or collapsed under loads. Graves lined construction routes, sometimes marked, often forgotten. Folklore grew around these deaths. Stories of spirits haunting the wall, of souls buried within the mortar. The saying, "The Great Wall is the world's longest cemetery," reflects this grim truth. And yet, despite the suffering, the work continued. Supervisors and soldiers ensured discipline. Reports flowed to governors and then to the imperial court. Each emperor measured his reign partly in how much wall he added, how many towers rose under his orders. For rulers, the wall was a visible legacy, a line of stone etched into landscapes. For workers, it was endless repetition, measured in handspans and blisters. Organisation was key. Sections of wall were divided among groups. Each crew was responsible for a stretch, often just a few dozen metres. Foremen directed them, shouting instructions, timing breaks. Work was staggered. Some dug foundations, others carried bricks, others laid mortar, others smoothed surfaces. Division of labour allowed speed, but it also locked men into monotony. A carrier might haul bricks for years without ever laying one. A mixer might stir mortar without ever seeing the wall rise above him. Despite the monotony, pride sometimes crept in. Workers marked bricks with stamps or symbols, leaving traces of their hands. Archaeologists still find bricks bearing names, dates, or small carvings. These were not official but personal silent acts of memory. A man who knew he might die at the wall left his name in clay, hoping someone would remember. The environment itself tested endurance. Summers scorched workers under relentless sun. Winters froze mortar in buckets. Winds carried dust that filled eyes and lungs. In northern provinces, water froze in jars before it could be mixed. Still, the schedule demanded progress. Work slowed but never stopped entirely. The wall did not wait for weather, even rest carried weight. At night, workers crowded into crude shelters, sleeping on mats of straw. Fires burned low, food was rationed, fatigue hung heavy. Songs and laments echoed. Poems of longing for home, of grief for lost companions. Folk songs from wall regions often speak of endless toil, of bricks carried on weary shoulders, of families separated by duty. These songs preserve what records do not: the emotions of ordinary men pressed into extraordinary labour. The human cost did not always go unnoticed. Some officials recorded their pity, noting high death rates and the burden on local villages. Others criticised excessive building, calling it wasteful. But emperors pressed on. Defence demanded walls, and walls demanded lives. In this calculus, human suffering became another line in ledgers, weighed against military threat. Still, the system endured because it was organised. From kilns in lowlands to towers on ridges, every step was monitored. Supplies were scheduled, labour allocated, punishments enforced. It was bureaucracy as much as masonry. Without officials tracking grain deliveries, without foremen counting bricks, the wall would have collapsed under its own weight. Its survival as a monument is also a testament to paper records and clerks with brushes. So when you stand today on the Ming Wall and look across its vastness, remember the invisible system beneath it, the convoys of donkeys on narrow paths, the foremen shouting at weary men, the kilns glowing day and night, the ledgers filled with numbers. What seems solid stone is in fact a history of organisation, discipline and sacrifice. We close the story of Ming bricklayers not in the heat of labour or the strictness of supervisors, but in the silence of endurance. The Great Wall still stretches across mountains and valleys, its bricks weathered yet standing, its towers ruined yet recognisable. Behind each stone lies the memory of hands that measured, carried and laid. To understand the wall today is to remember not only emperors who ordered it, but bricklayers whose patience gave it form. By the late Ming period, the wall had grown into one of the largest construction efforts in history. It stretched thousands of kilometres, lined with watchtowers, forts and garrisons. To the court in Beijing it was a shield. To historians today it is a symbol. But to the men who built it, it was weight. Bricks pressing on backs, mortar drying too quickly in wind, nights spent aching on the straw mats. Their perspective was not grandeur, but repetition. Archaeological studies show how consistent their work was. Bricks stamped with dates and names still appear along sections of the wall. Each one is a quiet assertion of presence. I was here. I made this. These marks are small victories against anonymity. The wall is vast, but the marks are intimate, human. They tell us that workers sought memory, even when official records ignored their lives. The wall itself remembers them in another way, in its scale. To climb its steep stairs today is to feel the weight of labour. Each brick was carried, each stone set, each mortar line smoothed. What now seems an unbroken monument was once endless daily effort. It is a grave as much as a fortress, built on lives given, bodies buried, sacrifices forgotten. Folk sayings captured this truth. For every brick, a life. Yet beyond suffering lies legacy. The wall endured not only as defence but as imagination. Poets wrote of its vastness, travellers marvelled at its length, dynasties used it as symbol of legitimacy. In later centuries, it became a source of pride for China, proof of endurance against hardship. The bricklayer's monotonous work transformed into national identity. The endurance of the wall also speaks to the patience of small acts. A handspan repeated becomes a fortress. Mortar smoothed again and again becomes endurance. Bureaucracy recorded in ledgers becomes permanence. Empires are often remembered for battles, but their true survival rests on such boring repetitions. Without the bricklayer's daily effort, the wall would have been a dream of emperors only, not a reality. Today, visitors walk along restored sections. They take photographs, admire the views, marvel at its scale. Few pause to imagine the men who mix mortar, the women who carried water, the donkeys that brayed under loads, yet their presence lingers in every step. The wall is their monument, even if history did not give them names. And perhaps that is the final meaning of this story. Great structures are not built in moments of glory, but in years of monotony. Handspan by handspan, brick by brick, the wall rose. What emperors ordered, labourers accomplished. Their lives were short, their toil immense, their recognition small. Yet without them, there would be no wall to remember. So imagine, as you close your eyes, a worker centuries ago. He kneels in dust, lays a brick, taps it with his mallet, smooths the mortar. He measures by his hand, wipes sweat from his brow, reaches for another brick. Around him stretch thousands of men doing the same. Above him, mountains wait. Behind him, kilns smoke. Before him, years of labour stretch ahead. He does not know the wall will endure for centuries. He knows only the brick in his hand. In cold stone scriptoria, medieval monks bent over parchment, measuring hours not by clocks but by candle ends melting into silence. In the imagination of history, medieval monasteries glow with mystery. Their cloisters echo with chants, their bells mark the hours, their stone walls enclose lives of discipline. But inside those walls, in quiet rooms lit by flickering candles, another labour unfolded, one that was slow, repetitive, and essential. This was the work of the scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts by hand. Their task was not glory or invention, but preservation, counted hour by hour in the dim light of burning candles. The scriptorium was rarely grand. Often, it was a long hall with wooden desks, each desk angled to hold a sheet of parchment. Windows were small, for glass was costly and wide panes let in draughts. Light was precious, but too much sunlight faded ink. Too little left the page invisible. So monks relied on candles and oil lamps, measuring their day by how much wax melted into pools, by how many inches of wick remained. A candle's length became the measure of knowledge. The monk who entered the scriptorium entered silence. Talking was forbidden, save for whispers when absolutely necessary. The scratching of quills was the dominant sound, broken only by the creak of a bench, the shuffle of sandals or the faint crackle of flame. This was the soundscape of preservation, the noise of civilization being saved from forgetting. Parchment was the canvas of their work, made from animal skins scraped, stretched, and smoothed, until they held ink without bleeding. Preparing it was labour in itself. Skins were soaked in lime, dried on frames scraped with knives until thin and even. Each sheet represented hours of work before a single word was written. To waste parchment through error was shameful. To blot ink was to mar not only a page, but the labour of shepherds, tanners, and parchment makers. The ink, too, was carefully made. Black ink came from soot mixed with gum and water, or from gall nuts boiled with iron salts. Red ink used cinnabar or vermilion, costly and precious. Colours for illumination: blue from lapis lazuli, green from verdigris, gold from leaf beaten thin, were treasures in themselves. A monk dipping his quill into such colours was touching wealth as surely as a merchant handling coins. The act of writing demanded patience. Letters had to be even, margins straight, spacing exact. Quills were trimmed with knives to keep sharp points. Errors were scraped away with pumice, though traces often remained. A monk might spend hours on a single page, his eyes straining, his fingers cramped. Candle smoke stung, wax dripped, shadows shifted. Yet line after line, page after page, he copied. His reward was not recognition, for most manuscripts bear no names of scribes. His reward was discipline fulfilled, duty completed. time was measured differently in the scriptorium. Bells rang for prayers, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Between these hours, monks wrote. But within the scriptorium itself, time was also marked by candles. A candle burned down might last 2 or 3 hours. A monk could judge his progress by how much light remained. Half a candle might mean a page or 2 copied. A full candle might mean a quire finished. Knowledge itself was preserved by wax and wick. Consider the monotony. The same words repeated, the same gestures of dipping quill, drawing letters, pausing to sharpen. Some copied scripture, others commentaries, others classical texts. Few understood all they copied. Their duty was accuracy, not interpretation. To add or omit was sin. Their task was to preserve words, not their own thoughts, and so their individuality vanished into lines of ink, their identity dissolved into duty. Yet without them, much of ancient knowledge would have vanished. The writings of Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Augustine, Jerome, all survived because monks bent over desks copying them by candlelight. The silence of the scriptorium saved civilization from silence of another kind, forgetting. Daily life in these rooms had its rhythms. At dawn, monks filed in, lit candles, opened volumes, and began. At midday, they paused for a meal of bread, broth, and ale. Then back to desks until vespers. In winter, days were short, candles burned more quickly, fingers numbed with cold. In summer, heat made wax drip and parchments curl. Every season imposed difficulties, yet the work continued. For centuries, monasteries across Europe repeated this routine. Supervisors enforced discipline. The armarius assigned tasks, distributed texts to be copied, checked accuracy. Mistakes could bring penance, fasting, extra prayers, or humiliating correction. Yet despite rules, small human touches crept in. Margins sometimes carried doodles, faces, animals, jokes. One monk, weary of silence, scribbled, "So many words, my hand is weary." Another wrote, "Pray for me, for I grow cold." These voices pierce across centuries, reminding us that behind every page was a person. The candle itself became symbol. Wax melted as time melted. Knowledge endured, but at the cost of light consumed. Hours passed, eyes strained. To copy by candlelight was to trade one form of life for another. Wax for words, hours for lines, fatigue for memory. Civilization was preserved in this slow exchange. If the first part of this story introduced the silence of the scriptorium and the slow labour of copying, the second part must explore the structures behind it, the hierarchy of scribes, the economy of manuscripts, and the trade in materials that kept candles burning and quills scratching. Every scriptorium required order. At its head stood the armarius, the monk responsible for the library. He distributed books to be copied, assigned scribes to tasks, and checked work for accuracy. Beneath him were skilled scribes who specialised in script. Some were trained to copy texts exactly, letter for letter. Others prepared headings, painted initials, or applied gold leaf. Below them were novices and assistants, men who prepared parchment, sharpened quills, and mixed ink. The system resembled a workshop more than a library, with tasks divided, progress tracked, and errors punished. The work was costly. A single manuscript could take months or years to complete. Parchment required entire herds of sheep or calves. Ink demanded gall nuts, soot, minerals, and labour. Candles consumed beeswax or tallow, supplied by monasteries' estates or purchased from merchants. Every page represented not only hours of writing, but networks of production. Shepherds raising flocks, tanners scraping hides, apothecaries grinding pigments, beekeepers tending hives. The silence of the scriptorium rested on the noise of villages, workshops, and fields. The economics of manuscripts was striking. To copy a Bible, dozens of skins were needed, perhaps over 100. A monastery might dedicate years of resources to a single volume. Wealthy patrons often commissioned such works, donating funds or materials in exchange for prayers. In this way, the copying of texts became both spiritual duty and economic enterprise. Monasteries preserved knowledge, but they also managed trade. The hierarchy of scribes extended beyond work into prestige. Skilled calligraphers were respected, sometimes even named in colophons at the end of manuscripts. Illuminators, who painted decorated initials or miniature scenes, were prized. their colours and gold leaf transformed books into treasures. Yet most scribes remained anonymous, their labour subsumed into the collective duty of the monastery. To serve God was to erase self. The silence of scriptoria was not only discipline but necessity. Concentration mattered. One error repeated could ruin an entire page. Some scribes developed elaborate checking systems. Texts were read aloud by one monk while others compared against their copies. Errors were corrected by scraping parchment with pumice and rewriting. Margins sometimes show notes from supervisors pointing out mistakes or corrections squeezed between lines. Accuracy was paramount, for error meant sin, not just sloppiness. But silence also produced voices in margins. Bored scribes wrote complaints. The ink is thin. The parchment is hairy. My hand aches. Others scribbled small jokes, drawings of animals, caricatures of faces. Some even left personal pleas. Pray for the scribe who wrote this. These marginal voices, half hidden, reveal the humanity behind the discipline. Candles remained constant companions. Their light was steady but smoky, leaving blackened walls in old scriptoria. Wax dripped onto desks, sometimes onto manuscripts themselves. Candle making was thus a vital supply. Beeswax candles burned longer and cleaner, but they were costly. Tallow candles made from animal fat were cheaper but smoked more. Monasteries balanced cost with necessity, sometimes rationing candles so strictly that scribes could only write during certain hours. To run out of wax was to halt the preservation of knowledge. The trade in materials reached far. Lapis lazuli for blue pigment came from mines in Afghanistan, carried along trade routes through the Middle East into Europe. Vermilion for red came from cinnabar, mined and ground into powder. Gold leaf was beaten thin in workshops, sold by merchants to monasteries. Thus, the work of a monk bent over parchment in France or Germany was linked to distant lands. Knowledge was preserved not only by silence, but by trade spanning continents. The economics of manuscripts meant they were rare. A single book was a treasure. Libraries in monasteries might hold dozens, occasionally hundreds, but rarely more. Each was chained to shelves, not to prevent theft from outside, but to keep monks from misplacing them. Borrowing was heavily restricted. To lose a book was disaster. Rules governed care. Books must not be left open in sunlight, must not be handled with dirty hands, must not be carried outside without permission. In an age before printing, each volume was irreplaceable. Patrons often requested books for donation. A noble might give funds for a psalter to be copied, ensuring prayers for his soul. A king might request chronicles cementing his legacy. Monasteries responded with diligence, for patronage meant support. The silence of the scriptorium thus served both spiritual and worldly needs. Knowledge was preserved, but so too were reputations and alliances. The hierarchy of labour reached beyond monks themselves. Lay brothers sometimes assisted, especially in preparing parchment or tending candles. Local craftsmen provided supplies. Villagers traded food in exchange for manuscripts read aloud during services. The scriptorium was thus not isolated, but part of a network of economy and community. And yet, within its walls, time still flowed by candle ends. A monk might spend an entire day copying a single chapter, stopping only when wax ran low. He might measure his week not by events outside, but by quires completed, by how many sheets filled with ink. His year might be marked by the completion of a single book. Entire lifetimes passed in this rhythm, unseen by the world beyond monastery walls. What resulted was preservation. Works of antiquity, Cicero, Aristotle, Ovid, survived because monks copied them, even if they did not fully grasp their meaning. Scripture endured because monks transmitted it through centuries. Commentaries, chronicles, law codes, all were saved in this silence. Civilization's continuity depended on men who counted hours by candles, who submitted individuality to repetition, who saw duty in ink and wax. The story of medieval scriptoria ends not with their silence, but with their fading into memory. By the late 15th century, a new invention, the printing press, began to sweep across Europe. What had once taken years of patient copying could now be reproduced in days. The silence of monks bent over parchment gave way to the noise of presses stamping pages in rapid rhythm. And yet, the centuries of candlelit copying left a legacy that no press could erase. Before printing, scriptoria were the only bridges across centuries of forgetting. When the Western Roman Empire fell, when cities declined, when libraries burned, it was in monasteries that words survived. Pagan authors, Christian fathers, poets, philosophers, even medical texts, all endured because anonymous hands copied them line by line. Without those hands, Renaissance humanists would have had little to rediscover. Civilization's revival was rooted in Candlelight. But with the arrival of printing, the work of scriptoria slowed. Many monasteries closed their copying halls, their desks abandoned, their candles unlit. Some continued for a time, copying luxury manuscripts for wealthy patrons, illuminated with gold and intricate initials. Yet the steady, anonymous copying of scripture and commentary ceased. The world no longer needed dozens of monks to reproduce the Bible, when presses could print hundreds of copies. The silence was broken, replaced by speed. Still, the legacy of scriptoria remained. The manuscripts they produced are today the treasures of libraries and museums. Each one is unique, bearing the marks of hands, the drips of wax, the doodles of weary scribes. Some are richly illuminated, others plain and worn. All are irreplaceable because they are not just texts, but artifacts of labour. Each page tells two stories: the words "it" carries, and the life of the man who copied it. Their legacy is also in continuity. Without them, ancient knowledge would have been lost in the centuries between antiquity and print. The writings of Aristotle, Plato, Virgil and Cicero survived because monks saw value in copying them. The Bible, which shaped Europe's culture and law, survived in consistent transmission because scriptoria multiplied it. Even local chronicles, laws and genealogies were preserved, giving us glimpses into medieval lives. The silence of scriptoria still speaks in every library. And beyond preservation, there is metaphor. The image of the monk bent over his desk, candle burning low, quill scratching on parchment, has become a symbol of patience and devotion. It represents the idea that civilization depends not on sudden triumphs, but on steady, unnoticed labour. The monk did not seek recognition, yet his repetition sustained culture. Even in decline, echoes lingered. Printed books sometimes imitated manuscripts with large decorated initials, margins for glosses, even faux candle stains. Readers had grown used to the visual language of manuscripts, and printers borrowed it. In this way, the style of scriptoria survived even as their silence ended. What remains most striking is the thought of time. A monk might spend a year on a single volume. He measured progress by candle ends, by quires completed, by lines filled with ink. He may never have seen the finished book bound. He may have died before completion, and yet his work endured. Centuries later, readers open those books, see his letters, and know that his patience outlived him. The candle burned down, but the words survived. Today, in great libraries, Oxford, Paris, Rome, Vienna, you can still see these manuscripts. They rest in glass cases, their pages turned slowly by curators. Visitors lean close, reading tiny letters, admiring illuminations. Few imagine the cold rooms where they were written, the wax that dripped on desks, the aching hands that formed each stroke. Yet those details are there, invisible but real, the foundation of the words we still read. The silence of scriptoria teaches us that history's survival is boring work. It is not the glory of kings or the clash of armies, but the steady flame of a candle, the scratch of a quill, the discipline of silence. Without it, memory would have gone dark. So imagine, as this story closes, one final scene. A monk sits alone at his desk. The candle before him burns low, its wax pooling. He bends over a page, letters half-formed. His eyes ache, his hand trembles, but he keeps writing. Outside, bells toll for prayer. Inside, silence holds. The candle flickers, the page fills, the night passes. Centuries later, his work remains. He is gone, the candle is gone, but the words endure.